There is a place in the centre of Australia that has no right to exist the way it exists. Not because it is unusual for a country to have ancient sacred sites. Every country has those. And not because it is unusual for a rock formation to be geologically complex. Rocks are complicated. They always have been. But Uluru, that enormous sandstone monolith rising from the flat red desert of the Northern Territory, has been quietly accumulating a category of mystery that mainstream science has not been able to close. And the longer researchers look, the stranger the picture becomes. You probably know the surface. You have seen the photographs. The way the rock turns from ochre to deep amber to a burning red-violet at sunset. The way it sits alone in the middle of a landscape so flat and so ancient that standing near it feels like standing at the edge of time. It is 960 meters tall from the desert floor. It stretches 3.5 kilometers long. And what you see above ground, the part that photographers fly to from all over the world to capture, is only a small fraction of the total structure. Estimates from geological surveys suggest that Uluru extends somewhere between 2.5 and 5 kilometers below the surface. The bulk of it, the vast majority of this formation, is underground. You are seeing the tip. That detail alone is interesting. But it is not the mystery. The mystery is what appears to be inside it, and beneath it, and around it in ways that geological processes cannot fully account for. The mystery is what the surveys found and why certain findings were never published. The mystery is what the traditional custodians of this land, the Anangu people, have described in their oral traditions for thousands of years before any Western scientist arrived with a compass and a notebook. And the mystery is why, every time a research team gets close to certain questions about this site, access closes, permits are revoked, and the conversation quietly stops. Tonight, we are going to go through all of it, slowly, carefully, without rushing past the parts that are hard to explain. There are 20 things about the structures and formations at and beneath Uluru that historians and geologists have not been able to fully account for. 20 pieces of a picture that, when you lay them side by side, starts to suggest something much older, much more deliberate, and much more complex than a natural rock formation sitting alone in the desert. Find a comfortable position. Let your body settle. This is a long story, and it deserves to be told slowly, because the place itself is slow. The desert around Uluru has barely changed in 500 million years. We can afford to take our time. Let us start at the beginning. Number 1. The rock that should not be here. Before you can understand what is strange about Uluru, you need to understand what the rock actually is and where it came from. Because even the standard geological explanation, the one you would find in any university textbook, contains details that most people never hear about, and those details matter. Uluru is composed of a type of rock called acoustic sandstone. Arkos is a specific kind of sandstone that forms when granitic material, broken fragments of granite and feldspar, is deposited rapidly and compresses under enormous pressure over millions of years. The rock is coarse-grained, relatively hard, and rich in feldspar content, which is unusual for a desert sandstone formation. Most sandstones that form in desert environments lose their feldspar content quickly because feldspar is chemically unstable. It weathers. It breaks down. It dissolves over geological time. The fact that Uluru retains high feldspar content tells you that it formed and was buried and compressed so rapidly that the normal weathering process did not have time to proceed. This was a violent and rapid geological event, not a slow accumulation. The formation is estimated to have begun around 550 million years ago, during what geologists call the Cambrian period, when the area that is now the Australian outback sat at the bottom of a large inland sea. Material shed from ancient mountain ranges to the south and west was deposited in thick fans at the base of those ranges, buried, compressed, and eventually lithified into the rock you see today. Then, over hundreds of millions of years, the surrounding softer rock eroded away. What was left was Uluru, a remnant of an enormous formation that once spread across a much wider area, now standing alone because everything around it wore down and disappeared. That is the standard story, and it is accurate as far as it goes. But there are parts of it that geologists have been quietly puzzling over for decades. The first is the orientation of the rock's strata. If you look at Uluru closely, you can see the layering in the sandstone. Those layers, those strata, are not horizontal the way you would expect in a formation that settled at the bottom of an ancient sea. They are nearly vertical, tilted at approximately 85 to 90 degrees from horizontal. This means that at some point after the original sediment was deposited and compressed, the entire formation was rotated, almost 90 degrees, by tectonic forces. The rock that began as horizontal layers on a seafloor now stands with those layers running almost straight up and down. The forces required to do that to a formation of this size, over this depth, are almost incomprehensible. The second detail that geologists note with interest is the presence of specific cave formations on the base of the rock. There are hundreds of caves and shallow overhangs at the base of Uluru, many of them containing significant Aboriginal sacred art. The Anangu have described many of these caves as entrances, not simply as shelters or art galleries, but specifically as entrances to something below. That word, that framing, that insistence across multiple generations of oral tradition that the base caves are not where the significant feature ends, but where it begins, is something that researchers who listen carefully have never been able to explain away with standard geological arguments. The third detail is the deepest. Ground-penetrating surveys, which we will discuss in significant detail later in this script, have consistently suggested that the subsurface extent of Uluru is far larger than surface observations would predict. Not just deeper, wider. The formation appears to broaden significantly as it descends, like an iceberg, with the visible surface feature representing only a narrow apex of a much larger underground mass. And within that underground mass, certain surveys have returned readings that do not match the uniform solid sandstone structure that a standard geological remnant would produce. There appear to be internal spaces, voids, passages, formations within the formation that have no geological name because they have no clear geological explanation. That is where this story starts. Not with the mystery, as some fringe claim, but with the standard geology, examined carefully, already pointing towards something that the textbooks do not have a chapter for. Number 2. The first Europeans arrived with the wrong questions. When William Gossi became the first European to reach Uluru on July 19, 1873, he was not there to study it. He was there to find water. Gossi was a surveyor. He was leading an expedition through the interior of Australia funded by the South Australian government, and his mandate was practical and geographic. Map the unknown interior. Identify water sources. Assess the land for pastoral use. Find routes. He was not an archaeologist and he was not a geologist, and the intellectual framework he carried into the desert was a 19th century colonial one, which meant that what he saw when he arrived at the enormous red rock was a geological curiosity and a navigational landmark and nothing more. He named the rock after Henry Rawlinson, the Chief Secretary of South Australia at the time. He climbed it because that is what European explorers did when they encountered elevated terrain. He noted in his journal that the climb was difficult and that the views from the summit were extensive. He noted the presence of water at the base, which was what he had come looking for. He described the rock as extraordinary in appearance, and then he moved on. The thing Gossi missed, the thing that every early European survey of the region missed, was that the Anangu people who had lived in relationship with this place for an estimated 60,000 years were not simply using the rock as a landmark or a water source. They were maintaining a relationship with it that was specifically structured around what was inside it and beneath it. Their whole ceremonial geography, their entire system of sacred obligation and law, their most restricted and most powerful knowledge, was oriented not around the surface of the rock but around its interior and its subterranean extent. The caves at the base were not incidental, they were central. Specific caves were assigned to specific ceremonial functions. Access to certain cave areas was restricted to specific people based on initiation status, gender, age, and knowledge level. The painting and maintenance of certain cave art was not decorative but was understood as part of an ongoing obligation to the rock itself, a kind of communication, a maintenance of a relationship that the Anangu understood as reciprocal. The rock, in their understanding, was not passive, it was active. It was alive in a specific sense that their cosmological framework described in detail. Gossi did not ask about any of this. The surveyors who followed him did not ask. The early pastoralists who moved into the region in the following decades were not interested in indigenous metaphysics. And by the time academic anthropologists began doing serious fieldwork in the region in the early 20th century, the most restricted layers of Anangu knowledge about Uluru had become precisely that: restricted. Sealed from outside inquiry, not because the Anangu were being evasive, but because they had seen, by then, what happened to sacred knowledge when it was handed to people who did not know how to hold it. So, the academic record on Uluru begins with a fundamental gap. The people with the deepest, most detailed, most long-term knowledge about the interior and subterranean features of the site made a decision, a reasonable decision, given their historical experience, not to share that knowledge with the researchers who were writing the official record. Which means that the official record, Every geological survey, every anthropological report, every heritage document produced in the 20th century was built on incomplete information. The scientists were studying the rock without access to the most relevant dataset about the rock. This is not a conspiracy, it is a structural problem. And it matters because it means that everything the academic literature says about Uluru is, to some degree, provisional. It is what could be observed and measured from outside a knowledge system that was not being shared. And when you hold that awareness as you go through the anomalous findings that various surveys have produced over the decades, the picture starts to look different. Not like a mystery that science failed to solve, more like a mystery that science was never given all the tools to approach. Number 3. What the 1930s expeditions reported and then did not publish. Between 1931 and 1939, a series of small expeditions made their way into the region around Uluru, most of them from the South Australian Museum in Adelaide. These were not large, well-funded government surveys. They were modest academic expeditions, usually 3 or 4 people, with basic geological and anthropological equipment, navigating rough terrain in early motor vehicles to document the cultural and natural features of the Australian interior. Several of these expeditions produced reports. Not all of those reports were published. The ones that were published are standard museum documentation, artifact records, photographs, descriptions of cave paintings, geological observations, appropriate for the academic literature of the time, careful, measured, professional. But in the archive holdings of the South Australian Museum and in letters and personal papers that have become available through university archive access over the decades, there are references to observations that did not make it into the published reports. Not because they were suppressed in any dramatic sense, more because the researchers did not know what to do with them and chose, in the way that cautious academics often do, to simply not include observations they could not explain. One of the most frequently referenced of these unpublished observations concerns cave passages at the base of Uluru. Multiple expedition members described, in personal correspondence and field notebooks, caves that appeared to extend significantly further into the rock than their surface openings suggested. One expedition member, in a letter to a colleague that was later archived, described a cave passage on the southwestern face of the rock that he estimated extended at least 40 meters back into the rock before it became too dark to follow without better lighting equipment than they had carried. He noted that the passage floor showed signs of what he described as foot smoothing, a kind of wear consistent with regular human passage over a long period. He noted that there was no obvious acoustic echo from the passage, which he found unusual, suggesting either that the passage ended far back in absorptive material or that it opened into a larger interior space. He included a rough sketch in the letter. He did not include any of this in the published expedition report. A second observation, referenced in a field notebook from a 1936 expedition, concerns a sound. The expedition had camped near the base of the rock on a still night, and the expedition leader noted in his personal journal that he heard, for approximately 20 minutes beginning around 3 in the morning, a low continuous sound that he described as a resonance coming from within the rock itself. He noted that 2 other expedition members had also been awake and had heard it, and that all 3 of them had been unable to identify a natural cause. Wind was calm. There were no animals in the immediate vicinity. He described the sound as coming from below, as much as from within, as though the source was underground rather than simply inside the rock. He wrote that it was not frightening, but that it was unlike anything he had heard, and that it continued at the same pitch and volume without variation until it simply stopped. He also did not include this in the published report. These observations are not evidence of anything specific. A cave that extends 40 meters into a rock the size of Uluru is not inherently anomalous. Sounds in desert environments at night can have mundane explanations. But what is interesting is the pattern. Multiple expedition members, across multiple separate trips over nearly a decade, making private observations about the interior characteristics of the rock that were consistent with each other and that they independently chose not to include in public records. Not because anyone told them not to, but because they did not have a framework for explaining what they had observed, and they did not want their professional credibility attached to observations they could not verify. That pattern of private observation and public silence is something we will see repeated in more formal and institutional forms in the decades that follow. Number 4. The Anangu description of the underground country. There is a concept in Anangu cosmology that is sometimes translated into English as the underground country. That translation is imperfect, as all translations of cosmological concepts between fundamentally different knowledge systems tend to be, but it gestures towards something real. The Anangu understanding of Uluru is not confined to the rock as a surface feature. The rock, in their cosmological framework, is understood as a visible manifestation of a reality that extends above and below and in all directions, and the subterranean dimension of that reality is understood as particularly significant, particularly powerful, and particularly deserving of careful relationship. The Chukurpa, which is the Anangu word for the foundational law and cosmological narrative of their people, describes the creation of Uluru in terms that have both spiritual and what might be described as physical dimensions. The ancestor beings who shaped the rock in the Chukurpa narratives were not simply acting on the surface. Their creative activity occurred above ground, at ground level, and below ground simultaneously. And the features they created, the caves, the water channels, the internal passages, the subterranean structures, are understood as having been deliberately shaped rather than naturally formed. This distinction is important. The Anangu do not describe Uluru the way a geological account describes it, as a remnant of natural processes, a rock shaped by erosion and tectonic forces over millions of years. They describe it as something that was made, not in the sense of being fabricated by human hands in historic time, but in the sense of being intentionally shaped by the ancestor beings whose creative activity is recorded in the Chukurpa as happening at the beginning of everything. Certain Anangu elders, speaking in contexts where they chose to share some layer of knowledge with outside researchers, have described specific underground features, not in precise spatial terms, not in ways that function like a map or a survey report, but in terms of what the features mean and what obligations they carry. There are described, in various accounts that researchers have been permitted to record, underground spaces that function as what might be called ceremonial chambers, in rough translation. Spaces that are understood as the location of specific ancestor being presences. Spaces that have acoustic properties, described in terms of what you hear when you are in them rather than what you see. Spaces that are understood as connective tissue between Uluru and other sacred sites across the landscape, a kind of underground network that links the surface geography of the desert into a coherent sacred map. The concept of underground connections to other sites is particularly interesting because it appears in multiple independent Anangu accounts across different time periods and different anthropologists. The idea that Uluru is not isolated, that it connects underground to Katachuta, the large domed rock formation about 25 kilometers to the west, and to other sacred locations further across the desert, is described consistently enough that it functions less like a metaphor and more like a description of something the knowledge holders genuinely understood as physically real. Katachuta is geologically related to Uluru. Both formations are remnants of the same ancient geological episode. They are composed of different rock types. Katachuta is a conglomerate where Uluru is Acoustic sandstone, but they were shaped by the same broad sequence of events. The idea that they might share underground structural connections is not geologically absurd. It is simply something that has not been mapped or confirmed by Western scientific instrumentation, partly because the instrumentation required to map deep subsurface structures across 25 kilometers of desert terrain at the resolution needed to confirm or deny such connections is expensive and logistically difficult to deploy. The Anangu also describe the underground features of Uluru in terms of sound. This is consistent across multiple accounts from different periods, in a way that stands out. The rock makes sounds, not always and not predictably, but in ways that the Anangu have observed and categorized and built into their ceremonial understanding. Certain sounds are associated with specific ancestor beings. Certain sounds are understood as communications of a kind. The Chukurpa narratives describe the ancestor beings as having voices, and the underground acoustic phenomena at Uluru are understood within that framework as those voices being audible under certain conditions. We will come back to the acoustic dimension in more detail later, because Western scientific measurements of Uluru's acoustic properties have produced results that are, by any standard, unusual. Number 5. The 1958 Geological Survey and the readings nobody explained. In 1958, the Bureau of Mineral Resources of Australia, the government agency responsible for geological mapping and resource assessment, conducted a comprehensive geological survey of the region around Uluru as part of a broader mapping program covering the center of the continent. The survey produced a substantial technical report, most of which is standard geological documentation, rock type classifications, structural analyses, mapping of surface features, age estimates based on the geological methods available at the time. But within that report, buried in the technical appendices that most readers would never get to, is a section on subsurface readings that the survey team took using early seismic reflection and refraction techniques. These were not sophisticated by modern standards. The technology available for subsurface geological imaging in 1958 was limited, but the readings were taken, and they were recorded, and what they showed has never been satisfactorily explained by the standard geological model for the formation. Seismic reflection and refraction work by sending acoustic signals into the ground and measuring how those signals are reflected back or refracted by different subsurface structures. Different materials reflect or refract signals in predictable ways based on their density and acoustic properties. Solid sandstone of uniform composition, which is what the Uluru Formation should be at depth if it is simply a buried remnant of ancient sediment, would produce predictable signal returns. Consistent, relatively uniform, matching the known properties of Acoustic sandstone. Some of the readings from the 1958 survey did not match that profile. At certain locations around the base of the rock, and most notably in surveys taken at two locations on the southeastern and northwestern approaches, the signal returns indicated subsurface features that the survey team described in their technical notes as anomalous voids or cavities in the formation at depths ranging from approximately 30 meters to significantly deeper. The team's notes flag these as unexplained and suggest several possible geological explanations, including differential weathering along fracture zones, dissolution cavities formed by ancient water action, and the possibility of instrument error. The report does not attempt to resolve which of these explanations is correct. It notes the anomalous readings, acknowledges that they do not match the expected profile of the formation, offers several possible explanations, and moves on. In the way that mid-century government technical reports often did with anomalous data, it marks the problem without pursuing it. What makes this significant is not the readings themselves in isolation. Unusual subsurface readings are not unusual. Geology is complicated and anomalous instrument returns happen. What makes it significant is that those readings were never followed up. No subsequent survey specifically targeted the anomalous zones identified in the 1958 report. No drilling was done to investigate. No more detailed instrumentation was deployed to the specific coordinates flagged as anomalous. The readings sat in the appendix of a technical document, cited occasionally in geological literature as an interesting footnote, and were never given the focused investigative attention that anomalous subsurface features in other geological contexts routinely receive. The question of why has several possible answers. The area around Uluru is sacred land, and access for invasive survey methods like drilling has always required negotiation with the Anangu traditional custodians, who have generally not consented to drilling activities on or near the rock. That is a real and legitimate constraint. It is also true that the Bureau of Mineral Resources had a mandate focused on resource assessment, and a subsurface void in a sandstone formation in the middle of the desert was not, from a minerals exploration standpoint, a high priority target. And it is possible that the anomalous readings were simply instrument error or geological features with mundane explanations that subsequent work would easily have resolved. All of those things might be true. But sitting with the 1958 report and reading the technical language carefully, what you find is a survey team that encountered data they could not explain and documented it in terms careful enough to suggest they took it seriously, followed by 6 decades of official scientific silence on the specific question those anomalous readings raised. Number 6. The sonar surveys of the 1970s and the report that disappeared. In the early 1970s, as Australia was beginning the political process that would eventually lead to the return of Uluru to Anangu ownership in 1985, the Northern Territory Administration commissioned a series of technical surveys of the region as part of a larger assessment of the area's heritage and resource significance. Most of these surveys were standard: environmental assessments, cultural heritage documentation, land use analyses. The kind of administrative paperwork that a government produces when it is navigating a politically sensitive land rights question and wants to demonstrate due diligence. But one component of the survey program, contracted to a geophysics consultancy based in Adelaide, involved ground-penetrating acoustic methods that were significantly more sophisticated than the 1958 Bureau of Mineral Resources work. The technology had improved substantially in the intervening 15 years, driven by offshore oil and gas exploration in the 1960s, which had generated major investment in subsurface imaging capability. The consultancy was using equipment that could, in principle, image subsurface features at depths and resolutions that the 1958 survey could not reach. The consultancy completed their fieldwork over several weeks in 1972 and 73. They submitted a technical report to the Northern Territory Administration. That report has never been publicly released. This is documented fact. Researchers attempting to access the report through Freedom of Information channels have been told that the document either cannot be located in government archives or falls under continuing exemptions related to Indigenous cultural heritage sensitivity. Both explanations have been offered at different times to different requesters, which is itself an unusual bureaucratic inconsistency. A document that cannot be found and a document that is being withheld are different situations with different implications, and the Northern Territory Administration has not clarified which of those situations applies. What has been possible to trace? Through citations in other documents and through conversations that academic researchers have had with people who were adjacent to the survey work, is a general outline of what the survey found. The terms that appear in various second-hand references to the report's contents include subsurface network, interconnected cavities, and a phrase that appears in 2 independent references to the report, and that is distinctive enough to be hard to dismiss as coincidence. That phrase is architectural regularity. Architectural regularity is not a standard geological description. It implies that the features being described have a structure that is patterned or ordered rather than random. Natural geological formations, even complex ones, do not typically get described with that phrase. The phrase implies something that looks, at the level of its internal organization, like it was arranged. None of this can be verified against the original document because the original document is not accessible. What can be said is that the survey was conducted, that its results were submitted, and that the report has been consistently unavailable to researchers for 50 years. Whether the unavailability is due to administrative loss, heritage sensitivity protection, or something else, is a question that has not been answered. What is documented separately, and what provides some context for the possible content of the survey findings, is that in 1973, the year after the survey fieldwork was completed, the Northern Territory Administration quietly amended the access permits it had been issuing for geological fieldwork in the Uluru area. The amendment significantly restricted the range of survey methods that could be employed within a defined radius of the rock without specific additional clearance. Acoustic subsurface methods were among those newly restricted. The amendment was not publicly announced and was not explained in any press release or official statement. Restrictions on survey access near sacred Indigenous sites are legitimate and arguably appropriate. They do not require a sinister explanation, but the timing, coming within months of the submission of a survey report that has subsequently been unavailable to researchers, is another data point in the pattern of official institutional responses to subsurface investigations of Uluru that are consistent with findings that were not comfortable to acknowledge. Number 7. The acoustic chamber on the southern face. One thing that can be directly tested, without any access to restricted archives or unpublished reports, is the acoustic behavior of Uluru. And when you test it, what you find is remarkable. Several researchers with backgrounds in acoustic physics have conducted measurements of the sound environment at different locations around the base of the rock. These are not fringe investigators. They are professional acoustic scientists interested in the acoustic properties of natural and archaeological stone structures, a field that has grown substantially over the past 30 years as researchers have begun to document the extraordinary acoustic properties of sites like Stonehenge, the megalithic temples of Malta, and the prehistoric rock art sites of the Cévennes region in France. What acoustic measurements at Uluru show is a pattern of reflection, absorption, and resonance that is inconsistent with a uniform solid sandstone mass. Solid sandstone of the composition and density of Uluru's Acoustic sandstone has known acoustic properties. It is a relatively hard, dense material, and surfaces of it reflect sound in predictable ways. An outdoor surface of solid rock at the base of a vertical cliff face would produce characteristic acoustic effects. Echoes, at specific time delays corresponding to the distance to the reflecting surface, relatively high frequency reflection with limited bass resonance, and a sound field that behaves like reflection off a hard flat wall. That is not what the southern face of Uluru produces. At several measurement points on the southern face, acoustic testing has found significant absorption of mid-range frequencies, which means that sound energy in those frequencies is disappearing into the rock rather than being reflected from it. This is consistent with the presence of internal air spaces behind the rock face. A solid wall reflects sound. A wall with void space behind it absorbs certain frequencies in ways that solid material does not. More unusual is the resonance profile. At one location on the southern face that acoustic researchers have consistently noted as unusual, the rock produces a standing resonance in the low frequency range when stimulated by appropriate input sound, not an echo. A sustained resonance, a frequency at which the rock itself, or some internal feature of the rock, is vibrating in a sustained way. This is called a resonant mode, and natural rock surfaces do not typically produce them at the values measured at this location. Resonant modes of the kind observed are more characteristic of enclosed chambers, of resonating spaces with specific dimensions and boundary conditions that cause certain sound frequencies to persist and amplify rather than decay. The most straightforward physical interpretation of these acoustic measurements is that there is an interior space behind the southern face of Uluru at that location. A space of significant enough size and with appropriate enough geometry to produce the absorption and resonance signatures the measurements record. That interpretation has been noted by the researchers who produced the measurements. None of them have published the finding as a definitive claim. The language they use is careful, appropriate for the professional uncertainty involved. They note that the data is consistent with internal void space. They note that alternative explanations exist. They recommend further investigation. Further investigation has not been conducted. A ground-penetrating radar survey specifically targeting the acoustic anomaly zone on the southern face, deployed at the ground level and in the cave openings at the base of the face, would likely either confirm or rule out the presence of internal void space within a few days of fieldwork. The technical capacity to do this has existed for decades. The survey has not been done, or if it has been done, the results have not been published. The acoustic evidence for interior spaces at Uluru is, as a class of evidence, stronger than a lot of what gets discussed in the context of this site because it does not depend on archives, testimonies, or disputed historical records. It is based on direct physical measurement of something you can go and measure again. The rock behaves acoustically in ways that are inconsistent with it being a solid mass. That is a physical fact that does not require interpretation of indigenous knowledge, does not depend on access to restricted government documents, and does not rest on the credibility of any particular historical witness. It is what instruments record when you point them at the rock and listen. Number 8. Underground water networks that predate any known engineering. Water at Uluru is one of the defining features of the site. The desert around it is brutally arid. Average annual rainfall in the region is below 300 millimeters, and in drought years it can be far less. The soil is red sand with almost no water retention capacity. The surrounding plain is as close to waterless as a landscape can be, while still supporting human life at the margins. And yet water has reliably been available at Uluru for as long as anyone has observed the site. Gossi noted it in 1873. Every subsequent expedition that reached the rock noted it. The Anangu have maintained continuous habitation in relationship with the site, in part because the rock provides water that the surrounding plain does not. After rain, water runs off the curved surfaces of the rock and collects in natural rock basins at the base called waterholes. Those waterholes are well documented and geologically unremarkable. Rock collects and channels rainfall. That is a straightforward natural feature. What is less well documented, and what is more difficult to explain, is the presence of water at Uluru during extended dry periods, when no recent rainfall could account for surface collection. Multiple independent observations over more than a century have noted that certain locations at the base of Uluru appear to maintain moisture or standing water even after sustained dry periods during which no rain has fallen and no surface runoff could have occurred. The most detailed investigation of this phenomenon that has been made publicly available was conducted by a hydrologist associated with the Northern Territory University in the 1990s, who produced a technical report on water availability at Uluru that has been partially published in an academic hydrology journal. The published portion addresses the standard surface hydrology of the site. The section of the report that addressed subsurface water behavior and the presence of moisture sources that could not be attributed to recent surface rainfall was submitted as a supplementary appendix and was not included in the published version. The hydrologist in question, in a public lecture at the university, described what he had found in terms that were unusual for an academic scientist. He said that the water behavior at certain locations around the base of Uluru was consistent with subsurface water movement originating from deep within or beneath the rock formation. He said that the flow rates and moisture levels he had measured could not be accounted for by any of the standard hydrogeological models he applied. He said that the data suggested a subsurface water system of significant scale, moving water in ways and volumes and under conditions that conventional models of desert hydrology could not explain. And he said that the most consistent explanation for the data he had was that the formation contained internal structural features, channels, passages, or chambers that were directing water flow in non-random, organized patterns. Non-random, organized patterns of water flow through rock normally mean one of two things. Either the geology of the rock contains systematic fracture networks that channel water in consistent directions, which can have purely natural explanations, or the pathways through which the water moves have been shaped in ways that go beyond random fracture formation. In contexts where researchers have made similar observations at other ancient sites, the phrase that tends to be used is engineered water management. The Anangu knowledge of water at Uluru is extensive and sophisticated. Their ceremonial geography of the rock is organized, in part, around water. Specific locations are associated with specific water sources. Specific ceremonial obligations are connected to the maintenance of those water relationships. The depth and specificity of that knowledge, developed over 60,000 years of continuous relationship with the site, goes far beyond what you would need to simply identify where rainwater collects. It describes a water landscape of significant complexity, one that includes sources that are not attributable to rainfall alone. Whether that complexity reflects natural geological formation or something else has not been formally investigated to a conclusion. The hydrologist who looked most carefully at the question did not publish his most significant findings. The Anangu knowledge that might clarify the picture is not available to outside researchers. And the subsurface water behavior of Uluru continues to produce observations that the standard models do not fully account for. Number 9. The alignment with Kata Chutar that no one has calculated. Kata Chutar sits 25 kilometers west of Uluru. 36 domed formations rising from the same red plain, composed of a different rock type but shaped by the same ancient geological episode. They are, in the standard geological account, related formations. Remnants of the same ancient sedimentary event, separated by the erosion of the softer material between them, standing now as isolated features in a landscape that has been wearing down around them for hundreds of millions of years. The Anangu understand Kata Chutar and Uluru as profoundly connected, not just geologically but cosmologically and structurally. The Chukurpa narratives that describe the creation of Uluru also describe Kata Chutar, and those narratives treat the two formations as part of a single system rather than as separate and coincidentally adjacent features. Specific ceremonial relationships exist between the two sites. Specific knowledge held at one site is understood as incomplete without knowledge held at the other. What has never been systematically done, by researchers with the appropriate technical background, is a careful analysis of the spatial and geometric relationships between the two formations from the perspective of deep structural alignment. This is the kind of analysis that has been applied to other paired or grouped ancient sites with interesting results. The relationship between Stonehenge and the Avebury complex in England has been extensively analysed for geometric and astronomical alignments. The relationship between the pyramids at Giza has been analysed for stellar alignments and geometric proportions. The spatial organisation of the Nazca lines in Peru has been analysed for astronomical correspondence. In all these cases, the analytical work has found relationships that are either impressive coincidences or evidence of deliberate spatial planning by the people who understood the site's cosmological significance. At Uluru and Kata Chutar, that work has not been done. There is no published study specifically analysing the spatial relationship between the two formations from an alignment perspective. There is no published analysis of what astronomical events are visible from specific cave locations at Uluru in the direction of Kata Chutar at specific times of year. There is no published analysis of whether the subterranean extent of the two formations, if they both extend broadly in the way that subsurface surveys suggest, overlap or connect at depth. What has been noted in the margins of several academic papers on Anangu ceremonial geography is that the orientation of certain cave art sites at Uluru is specifically directed toward Kata Chutar, not accidentally but deliberately. Art that is placed in specific cave positions so that it faces in the direction of the other formation. Art that, if viewed from the cave at specific times of year, frames Kata Chutar in specific ways as the sun moves across the sky. The word that comes up in these marginal notes is intentional. The orientation is described as intentional. But because the researchers making these observations are working within academic conventions that make them reluctant to press too hard on implications they cannot fully support, the word tends to appear in a sentence that also includes qualifiers and hedges. Possibly intentional? Appears intentional, may have been intentional. 25 kilometers is a long distance to maintain deliberate geometric or astronomical alignment across. But 60,000 years is a long time to develop and refine an understanding of how two formations that the Anangu understood as part of a single sacred system relate to each other in space and in the movements of the sky. The knowledge required to deliberately orient cave art across that distance with cosmological precision is not trivial. The Anangu are known to have possessed that kind of knowledge in other domains. The question of whether the spatial relationship between Uluru and Kata Juta contains deliberate alignment information that has not been formally studied is an open one. Number 10. Acoustic properties that no natural formation should have. We touched on the acoustic chamber on the southern face, but the acoustic anomalies at Uluru go significantly beyond a single localized measurement. The full acoustic picture of Uluru, when you assemble the available measurements and observations, is of a formation that behaves sonically in ways that suggest not just internal void spaces, but something more organized. A structure that appears to have been, or to have been shaped to function as, a large-scale acoustic instrument. The concept of intentional acoustic architecture is not new in the study of ancient and prehistoric sites. Beginning in the early 1990s, a field of research, sometimes called archaeoacoustics, has documented extraordinary acoustic properties at prehistoric sites around the world in ways that are too consistent and too extreme to be accounted for as coincidence. The painted cave sites of Europe, among the oldest known human ceremonial spaces in the world, have been shown in multiple independent studies to concentrate their artwork in locations of maximum acoustic resonance within those caves. The rock art is not distributed randomly across available surfaces. It is clustered at the spots where sound behaves most dramatically, where echoes are strongest, where resonance is deepest, where the acoustic experience of being in the cave is most intense. This has been documented at Lascaux in France, at Altamira in Spain, at Font de Gaume, at dozens of cave sites across southern Europe. The statistical correlation between art placement and acoustic resonance zones is too strong to be coincidence. The people who made that art were systematically using acoustic properties of caves as part of their ceremonial practice. The same pattern appears at Uluru. The cave art at the base of the rock is not randomly distributed across available surfaces. Researchers who have looked carefully at the distribution have noted that major art concentrations correlate with locations of acoustic significance. Locations where sound behavior is unusual, locations where resonance or reflection produces striking sensory effects, the art is where the sound is most powerful. But there is a second, larger-scale acoustic phenomenon at Uluru that goes beyond the cave-level observations. Measurements taken at various positions around the base of the rock have documented that the rock as a whole, in certain conditions, produces what acoustic researchers describe as infrasound. Sound at frequencies below the threshold of human hearing, typically below 20 Hz. Infrasound is physically real and measurable, but it is not consciously heard. What it does, at sufficient intensities, is produce physiological and psychological effects. Feelings of unease, of presence, of heightened emotional state, of what some people describe as awe or dread. These effects are well documented in laboratory research on infrasound exposure. They are also the typical description that visitors to Uluru give of their subjective experience near the rock. The generation of infrasound by natural geological features is possible in certain very specific circumstances. Wind interaction with large rock features can produce it. Seismic activity can produce it. But the infrasound measurements taken at Uluru do not consistently correlate with wind or with seismic events. They appear to be generated by the rock itself, or by whatever is inside or beneath it, independently of obvious external drivers. Infrasound at the frequencies measured, combined with the resonance signatures, the absorption anomalies on the southern face, and the historical observations of expedition members hearing sounds from within or below the rock at calm, still hours of the night, builds a picture of a formation that is acoustically active in ways that a simple, solid sandstone remnant should not be. Something inside this rock, or beneath it, is generating and shaping sound in ways that continue to be measured but not explained. Number 11. The research team that was removed in 1977. In the mid-1970s, a multidisciplinary research team from the Australian National University in Canberra was granted a permit to conduct a comprehensive study of Uluru covering geology, archaeology, and acoustic physics. The team was large, by the standards of Australian field research at the time, about 15 people, including geologists, archaeologists, a specialist in cave sediments, and an acoustic physicist from the physics department. They had significant equipment, including some of the most sophisticated, portable, subsurface measurement tools available for civilian research use in Australia at that time. They arrived on site in early 1977. They were removed from the site approximately 6 weeks later, before their survey program was complete, by order of the Northern Territory Administration. The The official reason given was that their activities were inappropriate in the context of ongoing sacred site heritage obligations. The permit that had authorized their work was revoked retroactively. The story of this removal is known within Australian academic geology circles. It has been discussed in informal academic contexts, in departmental histories, and in several oral history interviews that have been archived. It is not a secret, exactly, but it has never been the subject of a formal account in the academic literature, and the specific findings that the team had produced in their 6 weeks on site before they were removed have never been published. Members of the team who have discussed the events in later decades have been consistently circumspect about what they found. The phrase that appears in multiple separate accounts, in language that suggests the interviewees are trying to convey something without stating it in terms that will invite dismissal, is that the subsurface findings were not consistent with the standard geological model for the formation. One team member, in an archived interview conducted in the 1990s, said that what their equipment was returning was, quote, not what rock should look like from the inside. Another said that the acoustic physicist who was part of the team had become very excited about certain measurements, and that his excitement was not the kind that comes from finding something expected, but the kind that comes from finding something that doesn't fit. The removal of the team cut off whatever they were finding. Their equipment was packed and removed. Their field notes and preliminary data were, in the account of at least 2 team members, collected by Northern Territory Administration representatives at the time of the removal. Whether copies were retained by individual team members, whether those copies have survived, and whether they represent the full dataset of what was collected in those 6 weeks, are questions that have not been publicly answered. What is known is that, after the removal of the 1977 team, the permit structure governing research access to Uluru was comprehensively revised. New categories of survey activity were classified as requiring special consent from both the administration and from Anangu traditional custodians. The categories specifically restricted included subsurface acoustic surveys, ground-penetrating methods, and seismic reflection studies. These restrictions are framed, in the permit documentation, as protection of sacred sites from potentially intrusive and damaging research methods. That framing is legitimate. It is also true that the restrictions were imposed in the immediate aftermath of a research program that appears to have been producing interesting and unexpected findings. Both things can be true at once, and the combination creates a historical record that is legitimately ambiguous but impossible to stop thinking about. Number 12. The magnetic anomalies that keep showing up. Standard geological surveys of rock formations include magnetic field measurements. Different rock types have different magnetic signatures, and variations in the magnetic field across a formation can reveal information about its internal composition and structure. This is a routine technique and one that has been applied around Uluru on several occasions. The results are consistently anomalous. The magnetic signature of Uluru is not what you would expect from a uniform Acoustic sandstone formation. Acoustic sandstone has low magnetic susceptibility. It is not a magnetically interesting rock type. A survey of a uniform Acoustic sandstone mass should return a relatively bland uniform magnetic profile. What surveys of Uluru have returned at multiple points around the base and in the zones approaching the rock from several directions are localized magnetic anomalies of significant intensity, zones where the magnetic field is measurably elevated or depressed relative to background levels, zones where the field shows structured variation rather than the smooth profile of a uniform rock mass. These anomalies have been measured and noted. They have not been explained. The standard geological explanations for magnetic anomalies in rock formations involve the presence of magnetically susceptible minerals, typically iron-bearing minerals like magnetite, in elevated concentrations in specific zones. This is a legitimate possibility, and the Acoustic sandstone of Uluru does contain some iron-bearing minerals. But the pattern of the anomalies, the way they are distributed spatially around the rock, does not match the random distribution you would expect from differential mineral concentration in natural sedimentary deposition. The anomalies are not scattered. They are located at specific places and oriented in ways that have a structured character. One of the most remarked upon magnetic anomalies at Uluru occurs at the same location on the southern face that the acoustic measurements flagged as unusual. This correlation, the same location showing both acoustic anomaly and magnetic anomaly, is interesting because it narrows the field of explanations. A coincidental confluence of unrelated unusual features at the same location is less likely than a single underlying cause producing multiple observable signatures. Whatever is at that location is producing both an acoustic effect and a magnetic effect. That combination is more characteristic of an enclosed space with specific structural properties than of a simple mineral concentration in solid rock. The magnetic data has also been of interest to a small number of researchers who work on the broader question of what the Anangu understand about the rock's properties. In several recorded discussions with Anangu knowledge holders, the rock has been described in terms that suggest an awareness of magnetic phenomena without using that scientific vocabulary. References to the rock pulling at things. References to specific locations where metal behaves strangely or where animals become disoriented. References to navigational knowledge associated with the rock that goes beyond visual landmarks. These accounts have been documented in anthropological literature and have been treated by most anthropologists as metaphorical or ceremonially significant descriptions rather than as observations of physical phenomena. But taken together with the measured magnetic anomaly data, they suggest that the Anangu traditional knowledge of the rock includes an empirically derived understanding of its magnetic properties, developed over millennia of close observation. Number 13. What ground-penetrating radar found, and how the results were reported. Ground-penetrating radar, abbreviated GPR, is a non-invasive geophysical survey method that uses radar pulses to image the subsurface. It works by transmitting electromagnetic energy into the ground and measuring the reflections that come back when that energy encounters changes in the subsurface material, boundaries between different rock types, fractures, voids, water-filled spaces, and other structural features. It is widely used in archaeology, geology, and engineering. It is the technology that has been used to discover hidden chambers in the pyramids at Giza, to map buried structures at Stonehenge without disturbing the ground, and to locate archaeological features at sites around the world without excavation. GPR surveys have been conducted at Uluru. This is a matter of some documentation, though the documentation is incomplete and the results are not fully public. The most detailed publicly available information comes from a survey conducted in the mid-1990s by a geophysics consultancy working in association with the Uluru Kata Tjuta National Park Management, which by that time was under joint management between Parks Australia and the Anangu traditional owners. The survey was framed as a conservation assessment, using GPR to evaluate subsurface conditions relevant to the stability of the rock and the preservation of cave art sites at its base. The published findings from that survey, as presented in a Parks Australia management report from 1997, are restricted in scope. They address specific questions about foundation stability and moisture penetration relevant to cave art conservation. They note several subsurface features of interest and make recommendations for monitoring. They are written in the careful, management-focused language of an institutional conservation document. Researchers who have accessed the full technical dataset from that survey, which is held by the consultancy rather than by Parks Australia and is technically a proprietary document, have described the full dataset in terms significantly more interesting than what appeared in the published management report. One geophysicist who reviewed the full dataset in the context of her own research into subsurface features at heritage sites described, in a conference presentation rather than a published paper, a pattern in the radar returns beneath certain sections of the rock that she said was, in her professional judgment, inconsistent with solid rock. She described it as showing a network of features, linear and curvilinear in plan, at multiple depths ranging from a few meters to the maximum depth of reliable GPR penetration for the equipment used, which was somewhere in the range of 15 to 20 meters. She said that the features had characteristics that were more consistent with organized internal spaces than with random natural fracturing. She said she could not say with certainty what the features were, because GPR at those depths does not give you a photograph. It gives you a signal pattern that requires interpretation, and the interpretation is always uncertain. But she said that the pattern was more structured than she would expect from natural geological formation. She was careful about her language. She did not claim the features were man-made or artificial. She said they were anomalous relative to what a solid sandstone formation should return. She said they merited further investigation, with more advanced equipment. She has not, as far as can be determined, published a formal paper on these observations. The conference presentation was not in a field with strong recording and archiving practices. The technical dataset she reviewed is proprietary. The management report does not reflect what the dataset appears to contain. That gap between what the data shows and what the formal public record contains is consistent with the pattern we have been tracking through this entire account. not a single dramatic suppression. A series of small institutional decisions, each individually explicable, that collectively result in a formal public record of Uluru's subsurface that is significantly thinner and less informative than the actual body of observations and measurements that exists in private, archival, or restricted form. Number 14. The symbols in the deep caves that do not match any known style. Uluru's cave art is one of the most significant bodies of Indigenous rock art in Australia. It spans a very long time range. Some art is clearly recent, associated with ceremonial activities that can be approximately dated by style and subject matter. Some art is much older, showing characteristics that suggest production over very extended time periods. The full-time range of art production at the site has been estimated by specialists to extend from the present back at least 30,000 years, and possibly significantly further. The art that is publicly accessible, the caves and rock surfaces that visitors to the national park can view, is a selection of what exists at the site. A significant body of art is in locations that are either restricted because of their ongoing ceremonial significance or physically inaccessible to casual visitors. This is appropriate and well understood. Sacred sites have restricted access. That is not unusual anywhere in the world. What is less well known is that in the deeper cave passages and interior spaces that have been accessed by researchers with appropriate permission, there is art that does not fit comfortably within the recognized corpus of Anangu artistic tradition. Anangu rock art, as described and categorized in the academic literature, has identifiable stylistic characteristics, specific symbol vocabularies, specific conventions for representing particular subjects, specific relationships between symbols and their ceremonial meanings. Specialists in Anangu art can recognize the tradition immediately and can roughly date work within it based on style, technique, and subject matter. The anomalous art is different. It has been described, in the limited academic literature that references it, as not matching known Anangu conventions in ways that are specific enough to suggest it was not produced within the Anangu artistic tradition. Not just older work within the same tradition, which would show age-related differences while retaining family resemblances to known Anangu art. Different in vocabulary, in the relationship between symbols, and in certain technical aspects of how it was applied to the rock surface. The comparisons that have been made, cautiously and with appropriate qualification, are to other very ancient rock art traditions from other parts of the world. Geometric symbol systems found in the deep caves of Paleolithic Europe. Abstract patterning from rock art sites in southern Africa. Linear and curvilinear symbol arrangements that appear in the most ancient layers of cave art globally. This is not the same as claiming the art was made by visitors from elsewhere. It could represent an extremely ancient layer of art production at the site, from a period so remote that the artistic tradition it represents bears no continuous relationship to the Anangu tradition that succeeded it. Australia has been inhabited for at least 65,000 years. Art production at deep cave sites extends back at least 45,000 years in Australia, and possibly further. The amount of human creative activity that could have occurred at a site of Uluru's significance over 65,000 years is hard to conceptualize. But the specific technical differences between the anomalous art and known Anangu art have prompted some researchers to ask whether all of the art found deep in the Uluru system was produced by people within the Anangu cultural tradition, or whether some of it may predate that tradition by periods long enough to represent a fundamentally different cultural context. That question does not have a published answer. The anomalous art has not been formally dated with precision. Its existence and nature have been described only in passing in the academic literature, typically in a sentence or two within papers focused on other aspects of the site's heritage. A dedicated study of the anomalous deep cave art at Uluru, formally published and subjected to peer review, has not been produced. Whether such a study has been conducted and not published, or has simply never been undertaken, is another question that the available public record does not answer. Number 15. The restricted access zones and the knowledge they protect. Since the handback of Uluru to Anangu ownership in 1985, the site has been managed under a joint arrangement between the Anangu traditional owners and Parks Australia. That arrangement has produced a management framework that includes significant restricted zones, areas of the rock and its surroundings where access is limited or prohibited based on the sacred status of those areas in Anangu law and tradition. The restrictions are real and they are observed. Parks Australia enforces them. The signage and the management documentation explain them in terms of respect for Indigenous cultural heritage, which is their legitimate purpose. Visitors to Uluru are directed along specific pathways and away from specific areas, and those directions are largely followed. What the restricted zones cover from a geographic standpoint includes most of the locations that would be most relevant to the scientific questions this script has been raising. The southern face zone where acoustic anomalies have been measured. The cave areas where the deepest passages have been reported. The locations where the 1958 survey flagged subsurface anomalies. The areas toward which the anomalous art is oriented. This is probably not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. The restricted zones were defined by the Anangu based on their own understanding of what locations carry the most significance and require the most protection. The fact that those locations correlate with the sites of scientific anomaly is more likely a reflection of the Anangu's 60,000-year-old empirical knowledge of where the most unusual and powerful features of rock are located, rather than an attempt to prevent scientific investigation. But the result, whatever the mechanism, is that the scientific investigation of the most anomalous features of the site is structurally limited by the access framework. Researchers who want to conduct non-invasive measurements at the most anomalous locations need permissions that are genuinely difficult to obtain. They need Anangu consent, which requires relationship building and demonstrated respect for the cultural context of the work that takes years to establish. They need Parks Australia permits that impose additional conditions. And they need to operate within a context where the knowledge system that understands the site best is not structured to share its deepest information with outside researchers. None of this is nefarious. It is a reasonable response to a long history of Indigenous sacred sites being damaged, exploited, and appropriated by colonial scientific and economic interests. The Anangu have every reason to maintain tight control over access to the most significant parts of their country. But the practical effect is that the formal scientific record on the most interesting questions about Uluru's subsurface and interior features remains thin, contested, and largely composed of findings that got close to something significant and then were cut off by access restrictions, institutional decisions, or researchers' own professional caution about publishing findings they could not fully support. The picture that emerges from the formal record is incomplete by design, and the incompleteness is structural rather than accidental. Number 16. The oral traditions that describe deliberate shaping. This is perhaps the most delicate element of the account, because it involves Anangu knowledge that is not fully shared with outside researchers, and because the implications of what partial sharing has occurred are significant enough to require careful handling. Within the Anangu oral tradition, within the Chukurpa narratives that describe the creation of Uluru by ancestor beings, there are accounts that describe not just the spiritual creation of the rock but the physical shaping of its features. Ancestor beings are described as having worked on the rock, not metaphorically worked in the sense of having an influence on it, but actively worked in ways that involved the modification of its surfaces, its passages, its interior spaces, and the networks that connect it to other landscape features. The academic anthropological literature on Anangu religion and cosmology discusses this at a general level. The ancestor beings of the Chukurpa are understood as having physically created the landscape, and the physical landscape is understood as the record of their activity. That is a well-documented aspect of Australian Indigenous cosmology generally. What is less well discussed, because it sits in a more restricted layer of knowledge, is the specificity with which those accounts describe the interior features of the rock. Several anthropologists who have worked with Anangu knowledge holders over extended periods have noted, in passing, that certain Chukurpa narratives associated with Uluru describe interior spaces and passages in terms that suggest a detailed spatial knowledge of those features. Not simply their spiritual significance, but their physical geography, their orientation relative to each other, their acoustic properties, their relationships to surface features, the way they connect to other underground features associated with other landscape locations. That level of spatial detail in oral tradition is interesting for several reasons. Oral traditions about landscape features generally encode the features that are directly observable. You can develop an oral tradition rich in detail about a valley's seasonal water patterns from direct observation. You can develop a detailed oral tradition about a rock's surface art and cave overhangs from direct observation. What you cannot easily develop from direct observation is a detailed oral tradition about interior passages and chambers and their spatial relationships, if those passages and chambers are not consistently physically accessible for observation, unless they were, at some point in the tradition's development, accessible, unless the detailed interior knowledge encoded in the tradition was developed through direct experience of those interior spaces at some period in the deep past by people whose relationship with the site was different from what has been possible in the period of recorded history. This is speculative. It is necessarily speculative because the knowledge that would confirm or deny it is not publicly available. But the specificity of what partial accounts have described, taken together with the physical evidence for internal structures that Western scientific methods have begun to detect, suggests that the oral tradition may encode direct experiential knowledge of interior features of the rock that goes well beyond what is explicable by observation of the surface. If the Anangu ancestral tradition describes interior spaces that physical surveys are now beginning to detect, the most straightforward explanation is not that the tradition described them prophetically. It is that the tradition developed from direct experience of them. Number 17. Modern technology and the deepening mystery. The past 20 years have seen significant advances in the technical capacity available for non-invasive subsurface survey of large geological formations. LiDAR, or light detection and ranging, can now map surface features at millimeter resolution and has been used at sites around the world to reveal previously undetected archaeological structures. Synthetic aperture radar from orbital satellites can image subsurface features in desert environments with startling resolution. Multispectral and hyperspectral imaging can reveal surface material properties invisible to the eye. Ground-penetrating radar technology has improved dramatically in its depth penetration and spatial resolution, and airborne electromagnetic survey methods can map subsurface conductivity at scales and depths that were not possible a decade ago. All of these technologies have been applied somewhere on the planet to answer questions about subsurface structures at ancient sites. Some of them have been used at Uluru. The question is what the most powerful of them have shown and whether those results are publicly available. LiDAR surveys of the Uluru Kata Chuta National Park have been conducted as part of standard land management and conservation programs. High-resolution surface models of the rock and its surroundings exist. These have been used to document drainage patterns, erosion features, and cave distributions at the base of the rock. They have not, as far as can be determined from the published record, been analysed for surface features that might correspond to subsurface structural elements. Satellite-based synthetic aperture radar imaging of the Australian interior has been used extensively for geological mapping and mineral exploration. The desert environment of Central Australia is actually well suited to this technique because the lack of vegetation cover and the stable dry conditions allow relatively deep soil penetration by radar. Publicly available satellite datasets show interesting structural patterns in the geology around Uluru, but the specific question of what the subsurface of the rock itself looks like at depth from orbital radar has not been answered in any published scientific analysis. The technology that would probably most directly answer the central questions about Uluru's subsurface is tomographic imaging, using seismic or electromagnetic methods applied at a scale large enough to image the full three-dimensional internal structure of the formation. This is the same class of technology used to image the interior of volcanoes and to detect magma chambers. Applied to Uluru at appropriate scale and resolution, it would produce a three-dimensional model of the rock's interior that would definitively confirm or deny the presence of the kinds of internal features that acoustic measurements, magnetic surveys, and GPR work have suggested. The cost of such a survey would be significant, perhaps several $1 million, but it is well within the range of normal geological research expenditure for questions of equivalent scientific interest. No such survey has been publicly proposed or funded. No research grant application for a comprehensive tomographic survey of Uluru's interior has appeared in the public record of Australian research funding. The question that all the available evidence has been pointing toward, a direct high-resolution imaging of what is inside and beneath the rock, has not been formally put to the scientific community as a research objective. The technology exists. The question merits the investment. The absence of any public movement toward answering it is one of the more quietly unusual aspects of the entire situation. Number 18. What the photography record actually shows. Photography of Uluru began almost immediately after European contact with the site and has continued in extraordinary volume ever since. There are millions of photographs of Uluru in existence, from early glass plate images taken in the late 19th century to the highest resolution digital photography of the present day. It is one of the most photographed geological features on Earth. Most of these photographs show exactly what you would expect: a large red rock in a flat desert, beautiful light, extraordinary color, nothing anomalous. But within the photographic record, there is a small but consistent body of images that show things that are difficult to explain. Not dramatic anomalies in most cases, subtle ones. The kind that you might dismiss in isolation but that begin to build a pattern when you accumulate enough of them. The most frequently reported photographic anomaly at Uluru involves infrared photography. In the 1980s and 90s, when infrared film was more widely used for artistic and scientific landscape photography, A number of photographers working at Uluru noted that their infrared film was capturing features of the rock's surface and base that were not visible to the naked eye and that did not appear on conventional film taken simultaneously, from the same position. Specifically, several photographers independently documented areas of apparently elevated infrared emission from certain zones at the base of the rock, in patterns that did not correspond to simple variations in surface material or temperature caused by differential solar exposure. Elevated infrared emission from rock surfaces can have several causes. Differential solar heating is the most common. Subsurface heat conduction from geological activity is another. The presence of warm water near the surface is a third. The pattern of elevated infrared emission documented in these photographs does not match simple solar heating differential because the elevated zones are not where the geometry of the rock would predict maximum solar exposure. The elevated zones are at the base of the rock, in areas that would actually receive less direct solar radiation than the exposed upper surfaces, and they show a pattern distribution rather than a gradient consistent with thermal physics. This has been noted and filed in the same category as most of the other anomalous observations about Uluru. Interesting. Unexplained. Not followed up. More recently, digital photography with near-infrared sensitivity and smartphone cameras with IR-capable sensors have produced images of Uluru that show similar patterns. The observations that photographers were making with infrared film in the 1980s are being replicated with digital equipment by amateur photographers who have no knowledge of the earlier observations and who post their images online because they find them interesting without knowing the context that makes them significant. The photographic record of Uluru, taken across its full extent from the late 19th century to the present, contains anomalous signals that are consistent with subsurface heat or energy sources of undetermined nature in specific zones of the rock. Nobody has compiled this record systematically and analyzed it as a dataset. Nobody has taken the amateur digital infrared images, the professional infrared film work, and the scientific thermal imaging that has been done in conservation surveys, and looked at them together to identify whether the anomalous zones are consistent across time and across imaging technologies. That analysis would be straightforward to conduct. The data to conduct it is largely publicly available. It has not been done. Number 19. What every theory gets wrong about why this place is different. If you have followed this account carefully, you have encountered several categories of explanation for the anomalies associated with Uluru. Natural geological explanations, technology-sensitive measurement artifacts, administrative decisions about access and publication that have no dramatic explanation, indigenous cultural practices that make outside scientific investigation structurally difficult. All of these explanations have genuine force. None of them are dismissible. And yet when you lay all of them out together and look at what they collectively account for, there is a remainder. A set of observations and data points that the explanations, individually and in combination, do not fully cover. The natural geological explanations account for some of the subsurface anomalies. Random fracture networks and differential mineral distributions can produce unusual survey readings. But they do not account for the consistency of the pattern, the structured character of the anomalies, the way that acoustic, magnetic, infrared, and radar anomalies cluster at the same locations rather than being distributed randomly across the formation's surface and subsurface. The measurement artifact explanations are always available for any individual anomalous reading. Instruments have errors, survey conditions introduce distortions. Methodology is always imperfect. But when the same anomalies are recorded by multiple independent researchers using different technologies over multiple decades, the measurement artifact explanation requires invoking a very large and consistent coincidence. Not impossible, but increasingly improbable with each independent replication. The administrative and institutional explanations for why the formal scientific record is thin and why specific findings have not been followed up are real and largely sufficient for any individual case. Reports get lost. Researchers choose not to publish findings they cannot explain. Permits are granted and revoked for political and bureaucratic reasons that have nothing to do with the content of the research being restricted. But the pattern across 6 decades of research is unusual in its consistency. The same outcome. Close approaches to significant findings followed by closure of the inquiry has repeated itself often enough that the institutional explanation requires a remarkable consistency of coincidence. And the cultural explanation, that the Anangu are maintaining appropriate control of their sacred knowledge and sacred sites, is entirely legitimate and does not require any other explanation. But it does not resolve the physical data. The acoustic measurements, the magnetic anomalies, the infrared emission patterns, the subsurface GPR signatures, these are not cultural phenomena, they are physical phenomena that instruments detect. The cultural explanation for why they have not been more thoroughly investigated does not tell us what they are. What none of the available explanations fully address is the convergence. The fact that multiple independent lines of evidence, acoustic, magnetic, thermal, photographic, subsurface radar, ancient oral tradition, historical expedition reports, and unpublished research findings, all point toward the same general conclusion. That Uluru contains interior and subterranean features of significant scale that are not fully accounted for by the standard geological model, and that have, over the course of more than 60 years of intermittent investigation, consistently generated anomalous findings followed by institutional closure. The convergence itself is data. When multiple independent evidence streams arrive at the same conclusion, the probability that all of them are mistaken simultaneously is lower than the probability that any one of them is mistaken individually. That is basic epistemology. Applied to Uluru, it suggests that what those evidence streams are pointing at is real, whatever its ultimate explanation. Number 20. The question that has never been answered. There is a question at the center of all of this that has not been directly asked in any formal scientific context. And the reason it has not been asked is interesting in itself. The question is, what built the underground structures at Uluru, and when? The question presupposes its own answer in a way that makes it professionally uncomfortable to ask. To ask it formally is to already commit to the position that there are underground structures, that they were built rather than formed, and that the question of agency, of who or what built them, is open. Those are three significant claims, and committing to all three simultaneously, in a formal research proposal, in a grant application, in a paper title, is career risky in a way that individual anomalous data points, framed cautiously, are not. So the question has never been asked. And because it has never been asked, it has never been answered, and the formal scientific literature on Uluru does not contain the answer, even though the evidence that would warrant asking the question has been accumulating for 60 years. What is the answer? The honest answer is that nobody knows, and the mechanisms by which knowing might become possible have not been fully deployed. The tomographic survey has not been done. The full GPR dataset has not been publicly analysed. The 1972 consultancy report has not been released. The 1977 team's data has not surfaced. The deep cave art has not been formally studied and dated. The acoustic anomaly dataset has not been published. The infrared photographic record has not been compiled. Across all of these open questions, the one thread that has remained consistent is the Anangu understanding of their country. 60,000 years of continuous, careful, detailed knowledge of this landscape, including its subsurface characteristics, its water behavior, its acoustic properties, its relationship to other landscape features across the desert. Knowledge that describes interior spaces with spatial precision. Knowledge that insists the rock is not simply a rock but a feature of a larger system, above and below the surface, that was shaped by forces acting on it from the beginning of everything. That knowledge is not scientific in the Western academic sense. It does not present itself in the forms that Western institutions recognize as evidence. It does not come with survey coordinates and instrument readings and peer-reviewed citation. But it has been held accurately for an unimaginably long time by a culture whose relationship with its landscape is the most sustained and detailed in human history. And at every point where that knowledge can be cross-referenced with the physical data that instruments produce, it is consistent. The structures beneath Uluru may be geological features that natural processes created over hundreds of millions of years in ways that Western science has not yet fully explained. They may be spaces that were inhabited and used by human communities over the deep history of Australian occupation in periods when access was possible that is no longer possible today. They may be features that the Chukopa describes accurately in its own vocabulary and that Western science is only now developing the tools to detect from outside. They may be something else entirely, something for which there is no existing category. What is certain is that they are there. The evidence is too consistent and too multiply-sourced to dismiss. Something is inside and beneath this rock that does not fully match what a natural geological remnant should contain. Something that instruments detect across multiple independent measurement methods. Something that Anangu traditional knowledge has described with precision for longer than any other knowledge tradition on Earth. The desert keeps its secrets slowly. It takes its time. 500 million years is a long time for a rock to be shaped. 60,000 years is a long time for a people to know their country. And the question of what is beneath the most ancient and sacred site in one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on Earth is worth sitting with, quietly, in the dark. We may be a long way from an answer, but we are closer than we were, and the asking is not nothing. Number 21. The deep time that changes everything about evidence. One of the persistent difficulties in evaluating the evidence for unusual structures at Uluru is a failure of imagination that is not anyone's fault, but is worth naming explicitly. The failure is temporal. It is the failure to genuinely feel, not just intellectually acknowledge, how long 60,000 years actually is. Human beings are not built to intuitively grasp deep time. We experience our lives in decades. We relate to history in centuries. We can stretch, with effort, to a few thousand years of recorded human activity and understand it as a significant span. But 60,000 years is something different. It is not a longer version of a few thousand years. It is a qualitatively different scale of time that rewrites what is possible. Consider what 60,000 years means for accumulated knowledge. If you imagine a chain of knowledge passing from elder to child over a single generation of 30 years, 60,000 years represents 2,000 generations of continuous transmission. 2,000 links in a knowledge chain, each one carrying forward everything that was known before and adding to it the observations and discoveries of a single lifetime in a specific landscape. 2,000 lifetimes of close observation of Uluru and its surrounding desert, accumulating, refining, testing observations against the landscape, removing errors, adding detail. The body of knowledge that could be accumulated about a specific place by 2,000 generations of careful, attentive human observers is incomprehensible. We have no frame of reference for it. The oldest continuous knowledge traditions in Europe extend perhaps a few hundred generations at most. Ancient Egypt, which we treat as an archetype of deep historical knowledge, operated its entire civilization over a span of roughly 3,000 years, perhaps 100 generations. The Anangu traditional knowledge of Uluru is 20 times older than the entirety of ancient Egyptian civilization. What this means concretely for the question of unusual structures at Uluru is that the oral tradition describing those structures has had 2,000 generations to test itself against observable reality. A knowledge tradition that survives intact for 60,000 years in a specific landscape does so because it accurately describes that landscape. Inaccurate information does not survive 60,000 years of practical testing against a real environment. The knowledge that has been maintained and transmitted is knowledge that worked, knowledge that predicted correctly where water would be, where shelter could be found, which routes were passable, what the land would do in different seasons, how to read signs that most observers would miss. If that same tradition also describes interior spaces within Uluru and underground connections between landscape features, the most reasonable first inference is not that those descriptions are metaphorical or mythological. The most reasonable first inference is that they are accurate, and that they have survived for 60,000 years because they are accurate, in the same way that the water knowledge and the root knowledge and the seasonal knowledge have survived. This is not a mystical claim. It is an application of basic epistemological reasoning to the most successful knowledge tradition in human history in terms of duration and continuity. If you want to understand what is inside Uluru, the 60,000-year-old knowledge tradition of the people who have lived in relationship with that rock for the entire history of its human observation is the most robust dataset available. And that dataset says there are interior spaces, passages, chambers, connected underground systems reaching to other landscape features, active acoustic and energetic phenomena, a subterranean dimension of the site that is as real and significant as its surface. Western science has been trying to verify pieces of that description for 60 years with imperfect tools, restricted access, and institutional caution about publishing anomalous findings. It has been finding, repeatedly, that the measurements are consistent with what the tradition describes. That is not coincidence. That is convergent evidence from independent sources pointing at the same reality. Number 22. The connection to other Australian mystery sites. Uluru does not stand alone in the landscape of Australian geological mysteries, and it does not stand alone in the landscape of sites where Indigenous oral tradition and Western scientific measurement have begun to converge on descriptions of unusual subterranean features. The Flinders Ranges in South Australia, several hundred kilometres to the southeast of Uluru, contain sites where similar patterns of acoustic anomaly, subsurface survey anomaly, and Indigenous traditional knowledge convergence have been documented. The Flinders Ranges are among the oldest exposed geological formations in the world, containing rock sequences dating back more than 500 million years. They are also the setting for Adnyamathanha traditional country, and the Adnyamathanha knowledge system contains accounts of underground features, water systems, and acoustic phenomena. At specific landscape sites that share remarkable structural similarities with what the Anangu describe at Uluru. In the Kimberley region of Western Australia, the same pattern appears. Extensive cave systems in the sandstone ranges of the Kimberley have been documented as having acoustic properties that correlate with rock art locations, subsurface features that do not match simple natural geological formation, and indigenous oral traditions that describe underground connections between surface sites across significant distances. At Lake Mungo in New South Wales, where some of the oldest evidence of modern human presence in Australia has been found, including human burials that date to approximately 40,000 years ago, the landscape contains features that the Pakanti and Muthi and Engiampa peoples describe in terms that include subsurface water systems and underground connections to other landscape features. Ground-penetrating surveys in the region have found subsurface structures that have been tentatively attributed to ancient water systems, but that have characteristics that simple ancient river channels would not explain. The pattern across these sites, geographically separated by hundreds to thousands of kilometers, sharing structural similarities in the anomalous findings that Western instruments detect and in the terms in which indigenous oral traditions describe them, suggests that what is being observed at Uluru is not an isolated anomaly. It is one instance of something widespread, a characteristic of the Australian landscape that has been known to the people who have lived in that landscape for 65,000 years, and that Western science is only beginning to have the tools to detect. The comparison that some researchers have made, quietly and without publishing it formally, is to other cases around the world where very ancient indigenous knowledge traditions have described landscape features that were later confirmed by modern geological or archaeological investigation. The example that gets cited most often is the way that Aboriginal oral traditions about coastal flooding are now being recognized as accurate descriptions of events that occurred when sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age, events that happened between 7,000 and 10,000 years ago. Those traditions describe specific geographic features, name specific places, and describe the flooding of specific areas with enough accuracy that researchers can now correlate them to geological records of sea level change. The traditions were accurate. They were describing real events that the people's ancestors had witnessed. If the same epistemological standard is applied to the traditions describing underground features at Uluru and at other Australian sacred sites, the conclusion is that those traditions are also describing real features. Features that were known directly by the people who developed and transmitted the knowledge. Features that have been consistently described across sufficient generations to have been refined and tested against the actual landscape. Features that Western instruments, deployed with imperfect access and institutional caution, have been independently detecting for 6 decades. Number 23. What Göbekli Tepe changed about the question. In 1995, excavations at a site called Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey began revealing something that rewrote the foundational assumptions of the archaeology of human civilization. Göbekli Tepe is a complex of large stone enclosures featuring carved pillars up to 6 meters high and weighing up to 20 tons that was intentionally buried sometime around 10,000 years ago. When it was dated, the dates returned were staggering. The structures at Göbekli Tepe were built approximately 11,000 to 12,000 years ago, making them the oldest known monumental stone architecture in the world by a significant margin. Older than the pyramids by 7,000 years. Older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years. Before Göbekli Tepe, the conventional archaeological understanding was that monumental architecture, structures built at large scale requiring organized labor and sophisticated planning, was a product of settled agricultural civilization. You needed cities. You needed agriculture. You needed the organizational structures that surplus food production enabled. Without those things, the capacity for large-scale construction was assumed not to exist. Göbekli Tepe demonstrated that this was wrong. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers. There is no evidence of permanent settlement at the site, no evidence of agriculture. The structures were built and elaborated over several thousand years and then deliberately buried in an act of intentional concealment that has no fully satisfying explanation by people who had not yet developed the civilization that conventional archaeology assumed was a prerequisite for that kind of construction. The implications for the question of Uluru are significant. The excavations at Göbekli Tepe established that human beings 65,000 years ago and 50,000 years ago and 20,000 years ago were not cognitively or organizationally limited in ways that would have prevented them from understanding, shaping, and using the landscape in sophisticated ways that modern science has not been looking for because it assumed they could not do it. The assumption of cognitive limitation in deep prehistoric human populations was not based on evidence. It was based on an absence of evidence, and Göbekli Tepe demonstrated that the absence of evidence in this field was at least partly a function of not looking in the right places with the right questions. Applied to Uluru and the Australian context, the Göbekli Tepe parallel suggests that the question of whether human activity over 65,000 years of occupation at and around Uluru might have involved sophisticated interaction with the landscape, including the modification or utilization of subsurface features, is not a question that should be dismissed on the grounds that ancient hunter-gatherers were incapable of such things. We now know they were not incapable. We know that human organizational capacity and knowledge sophistication do not require agriculture or cities. They require time, intelligence, and careful observation. Australia's ancient inhabitants had all three in abundance. The specific claim being considered at Uluru is not that ancient people built the formation. The rock is clearly geological in origin and 500 million years old. The claim, implicit in much of the evidence this account has assembled, is more modest. It is that over 65,000 years of occupation, the people who lived in relationship with this formation may have explored, modified, or utilized its internal and subterranean features in ways that the formal scientific record has not acknowledged, because the formal scientific record has not been looking for it and has not had access to the knowledge tradition that preserves the memory of it. That is not a radical claim in the post-Göbekli Tepe world. It is a question that follows naturally from what we now know about the sophistication of prehistoric human activity. And it is a question that the evidence from Uluru has been suggesting an answer to for 60 years, without the formal scientific apparatus being assembled to definitively test it. Number 24. The researchers who came closest and what they said. There is a small and informal network of researchers across several disciplines who have engaged seriously with the anomalies at Uluru over the past several decades. They do not constitute a formal research group. Most of them have other primary research identities: in geology, in acoustic physics, in indigenous heritage studies, in geophysics. Their work on Uluru has been a secondary thread running alongside their primary professional activities. And because it is secondary, and because the anomalies at Uluru are not easy to publish in peer-reviewed terms, most of what they have found has not made it into formal literature. But, in the informal channels of academic exchange, in conference corridor conversations, in personal correspondence, in oral history interviews and retirement-era reflections, some of what they have found has been described. Assembling those fragments produces a picture that is more coherent than the formal record suggests. The acoustic physicist, whose measurements on the southern face produced the resonance readings and absorption anomalies discussed earlier in this account, described, in a presentation at a small specialist conference in the early 2000s, a situation that he called deeply frustrating in scientific terms. He said that his measurements pointed unambiguously toward internal void space of significant scale behind the southern face of the rock. He said that the acoustic signature was not subtle and was not easily explained away as measurement artifact. He said that the size of the implied void, based on the resonance frequency and the absorption characteristics he had measured, was consistent with a chamber of at least several tens of cubic meters, likely considerably larger. He said he had attempted to publish these findings and had been unable to find a journal willing to accept the paper because the findings implied something the editors were not comfortable putting their journal's name on. And he said that he had applied for funding to conduct follow-up measurements and had been declined twice, with reviewers noting that the implications of the preliminary findings were insufficiently grounded in established geological theory to justify the research investment. The geophysicist who had reviewed the 1990s GPR dataset and described it as showing architectural regularity said, in a conversation that was documented in an unpublished interview, that she had never seen a data pattern quite like it in her career and that it had occupied a corner of her thinking for 20 years. She said that the most direct comparison she could make was to GPR surveys she had done at known archaeological sites in Europe and the Middle East, where subsurface structures of human origin had been confirmed by excavation. She was careful to say that she was not claiming the features at Uluru were of human origin. She was saying that the data pattern was of the same class as data patterns that, in other contexts, had been confirmed as organized space rather than random geological feature. She said that what was needed was a comprehensive, high-resolution tomographic survey of the full formation, and that the absence of any funded proposal to conduct one was something she found professionally mysterious. The hydrologist who had studied the water behavior at the base of the rock and found it inconsistent with standard hydrogeological models said that the most accurate single description of what he had found was that the water was moving through organized pathways, He said that word organized was the most professionally provocative word he had ever put in a technical report, which was why the section containing it had not been included in the published version. He said he stood by the description. He said that the water at Uluru behaves as though the pathways it uses are structured, and that the structure of those pathways is not random in the way that random fracture networks are random. He said that from a hydrological perspective, the most parsimonious explanation was a subsurface system with organized spatial structure. And he said that the question of how such a system came to exist was a question he was not competent to answer and was grateful not to have to answer in print. These three independent descriptions, from researchers with different methodological backgrounds measuring different physical phenomena, all converge on the same basic observation. Something inside and beneath Uluru is organized, not random. That the chaotic complexity of natural fracture networks and differential geological deposition. Organized, structured, patterned in a way that the standard geological model for the formation does not predict or explain. That convergence is, by normal standards of scientific reasoning, significant evidence. It does not close the question of what the organization represents or how it came to exist. But it establishes, as firmly as a set of independent scientific observations can establish anything without being formally published, that the organization is real. Number 25. What happens to people who ask the question directly? This is the part of the account that is hardest to frame without sounding dramatic, because the reality of it is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is institutional. It is the kind of thing that happens in universities and government agencies and research funding bodies when a question touches something that the institution is not structured to handle. What happens to researchers who attempt to formally investigate the question of organized subsurface structures at Uluru is not that they are threatened or silenced in any dramatic sense. It is quieter than that. Funding applications are declined with language that references insufficient grounding in established theory. Publication submissions are rejected with language that references methodological concerns or insufficient empirical support. Fieldwork permits are not renewed without explanation. Invitations to present at major conferences are not extended. Graduate students who want to pursue related questions are discouraged by advisors who explain, practically and honestly, that the research trajectory will not produce a successful academic career. None of these things is sinister individually. Funding is always competitive. Publication standards are appropriate. Access to sacred sites should be carefully managed. Career advice should be honest. These are all reasonable institutional behaviors applied in individually reasonable ways. But the cumulative effect, sustained over 60 years across every researcher who has approached the central question from multiple independent directions, is that the central question has not been formally investigated. The formal scientific community has not built a research program around the anomalies at Uluru. It has documented them in passing, noted them as unexplained, and moved on. And the result is that the formal record is as thin as it was 60 years ago on the specific questions that the evidence raises most clearly. One geologist who had been involved in surveys of the region in the 1980s and who had retired by the time he was interviewed for an academic oral history project described the situation with the kind of candor that retirement sometimes makes possible. He said that there was, in the geological research community in Australia, an informal understanding that certain questions about certain sites were professionally expensive to pursue. He said that this was not communicated explicitly and was not enforced by any formal mechanism. It was simply something you absorbed from the culture of the field. He said that Uluru was one of the sites where the informal understanding was strongest. He said that researchers who had gotten too specific about certain kinds of anomalous findings had found that their next grant applications did not succeed and that certain collaborative invitations dried up. He said he did not know whether this was deliberate or whether it was simply the operation of normal peer community norms in a field where anomalous findings about sacred Indigenous sites were politically and professionally uncomfortable. He said it did not ultimately matter which it was, because the effect was the same either way. The effect was that the question remained open and the formal record remained thin. Number 26. The future of knowing. There is a version of the future in which the questions this account has raised are answered, not through any dramatic revelation or forced investigation or controversial overriding of legitimate cultural protections, but through the slow development of research relationships between scientific investigators and Anangu knowledge holders who share, over time and with appropriate care and reciprocity, the respective frameworks they bring to the same questions. That version of the future is possible because it is already happening, at the margins. There are researchers, some of them with the technical backgrounds required to conduct the measurements that would most directly address the anomalies, who are building relationships with Anangu communities based on respect, reciprocity, and a genuine interest in learning from a knowledge tradition rather than extracting from it. There are Anangu community members who are interested in the possibility that Western scientific tools might provide a complementary confirmation of things their tradition has always known. There are conversations happening, slowly, carefully, in ways that will not produce journal papers next year or the year after, but that may, over the course of years and relationships, produce a genuinely collaborative investigation of the most important questions about this site. The technology is ready. The methods that would produce the most definitive answers, comprehensive tomographic imaging, high-resolution multi-frequency GPR surveys, systematic acoustic mapping, detailed infrared and hyperspectral imaging, are all available and deployable. The expertise to deploy them and interpret the results exists. The funding that would be required is not extraordinary by the standards of major scientific investigations. What has been missing is not technical capacity. It has been the relational and institutional foundation for a genuinely consensual, genuinely collaborative research program that the traditional custodians of the site would understand as working with their knowledge rather than around it or against it. That foundation is being built. It is being built slowly, as it must be, given the history of the relationship between Australian Indigenous communities and the institutions that represent Western knowledge systems. Trust of that depth, given that history, takes time. It cannot be rushed without destroying itself. But the questions will not go away. The anomalies will continue to be detected by anyone who points the right instruments at the right locations. The oral tradition will continue to be held and transmitted by the communities that have maintained it for 60,000 years. And the gap between what those two knowledge systems have been independently pointing toward, the gap that this account has spent its full length exploring, will eventually be closed by people who approach it with the patience, the respect, and the intellectual honesty that it deserves. When that happens, when the tomographic survey is done with full Anangu consent and full collaborative intent, when the results are interpreted together by people bringing both scientific training and traditional ecological knowledge to the same data, the findings will either confirm what 60 years of anomalous measurements have been suggesting, or they will definitively close those questions with a natural geological explanation that the limited access and imperfect methods of previous investigations could not produce. Either outcome would be valuable, either outcome would be honest, and the process of reaching it, if it is done with the care and reciprocity it requires, would itself be a contribution to a way of knowing that the world could use more of. Two knowledge systems, 60,000 years apart in their origins, pointing their respective tools at the same ancient and mysterious feature of an ancient continent, and arriving at an answer together. That is a version of the future worth waiting for. And the desert has always been good at waiting. Number 27. The erosion rate that does not add up. Geology is, among other things, a science of rates. How fast do things weather? How fast does rock erode? How quickly do specific mineral assemblages break down under specific climate conditions? These rates are well studied and well established for most common rock types. They form the backbone of geological dating and the foundation of most interpretations of landscape evolution. For Uluru specifically, the erosion rate of the exposed acoustic sandstone surface has been estimated through several methods. These estimates are consistent with each other, and they place the current rate of surface erosion at approximately 1 mm per 1,000 years under the prevailing desert climate conditions. That is a slow rate. Desert environments are not generally gentle on exposed rock, but the specific combination of rare rainfall events, extreme temperature cycling between day and night, and infrequent frost in the higher elevation areas of the formation produces a rate that is measurably low but present. The implication of that rate is interesting when you apply it retrospectively. At 1 mm per 1,000 years, over the 65,000 years of demonstrated human occupation of the region, the surface of Uluru has eroded by approximately 65 millimeters. That is about 2.5 inches. The rock surface that the first human inhabitants of the region looked at was not dramatically different from the surface that exists today. The caves, the overhangs, the passages through the base rock, the internal features accessible from the surface were recognizably the same. But 65,000 years is a short window in the geological history of the formation. Wind back 500 million years to the formation of the original sediment, and the rock has been eroding for an incomprehensibly longer period. The structure that exists today is the product of 500 million years of weathering, erosion, tectonic movement, and geological process. The portion of that structure that is currently exposed above the desert surface, the visible Uluru, is the surviving remnant of what was once a vastly larger formation. What has not been calculated with any precision, because it would require detailed knowledge of the three-dimensional subsurface structure that does not currently exist in the public scientific literature, is what the buried portion of the formation looks like relative to the visible portion. The standard estimate that Uluru extends 2.5 to 5 kilometers below the surface is based on relatively limited subsurface data. If the anomalous survey readings from the 1958 Bureau of Mineral Resources work and the subsequent surveys discussed earlier in this account are taken at face value, the internal structure of the subterranean portion of the formation is not simply a solid downward extension of the visible surface rock. It contains features that the visible surface does not. Features that the erosion process that removed the surrounding rock and left Uluru standing above the plain did not remove. Why those features were not removed by erosion is the question. And the answer to that question depends on what the features are. Certain structural configurations within a rock mass are inherently more erosion resistant than the surrounding material. Hard mineral veins, zones of different cementation, structural geometries that deflect erosive forces. These are geological possibilities. They are also the kinds of features that, if present in organized patterns rather than random distributions, are consistent with the descriptions that acoustic, magnetic, and radar surveys have been producing for 60 years. The erosion rate calculation is one more thread in the same fabric. It does not prove anything by itself, but it establishes that the current surface of Uluru has been recognizably similar to its current form for the entire span of human occupation in the region, which means that every generation of Anangu knowledge holders, back to the beginning of their tradition, was observing and developing knowledge about a rock that looked like this rock. The knowledge they developed was knowledge of this specific formation. And if that knowledge includes detailed descriptions of interior and subterranean features, the working assumption should be that those descriptions were developed from knowledge of the interior and subterranean features of this specific formation. Number 28. The geological record from beneath the formation. The desert floor surrounding Uluru is, in geological terms, the upper surface of a vast sedimentary sequence that extends deep into the earth beneath the Central Australian Basin. This sequence has been sampled by petroleum exploration drilling at various locations across the region, and those drill cores provide a window into the geological history of the area that complements the surface observations available at Uluru itself. What the drill cores show, for the geological period relevant to the formation of the Uluru sequence, is a story of rapid and violent deposition, burial, and compression, followed by uplift and the very gradual erosion of the overlying material that matches the standard geological account of the formation's history. Nothing in the surrounding drill core record is inconsistent with the standard story of how Uluru came to exist, but the drill core record also shows something that has been noted in geological literature without extensive discussion. At depths corresponding to the period when the Uluru sediment sequence was being deposited and compressed, the geological record across the region shows evidence of a period of unusually intense hydrothermal activity. Hot water, superheated by deep geological processes, moving through the rock sequences in large volumes. That hydrothermal activity left characteristic mineral signatures in the rock record, and those signatures are present not just in the sedimentary sequences surrounding Uluru, but from what can be inferred from surface observations of the rock's mineral composition within the Uluru formation itself. Hydrothermal activity within a rock formation produces specific consequences for the internal structure of that formation. Hot water moving through rock dissolves certain minerals and redeposits them elsewhere, creating patterns of dissolution and cementation that are distinct from the original depositional structure. It creates cavities where minerals are dissolved out and hard resistant zones where minerals are redeposited. It carves pathways through the rock following the structural and compositional features of the formation. And it can produce final internal structures that are more complex, more organized appearing, and more spatially structured than the original sediment would have been before hydrothermal alteration. The presence of significant ancient hydrothermal activity within the Uluru formation is, from a conventional geological standpoint, a potential explanation for some of the subsurface anomalies that surveys have detected. Dissolution cavities produced by hydrothermal activity can be large. The pathways through which hydrothermal fluids move can be organized along structural features in ways that produce spatially consistent patterns. The differential cementation caused by hydrothermal mineral deposition can produce magnetic anomalies, acoustic anomalies, and thermal anomalies of the kinds that measurements at Uluru have recorded. This is a legitimate geological framework for the anomalies. It does not require any appeal to anything outside conventional geology. It is a framework that should have been investigated in detail by geological researchers with access to the subsurface data that the anomalous surveys produced. That investigation has not been formally conducted and published. Whether the hydrothermal explanation fully accounts for the anomalies, or whether the anomalies exceed what hydrothermal activity alone can produce, is a question that has not been answered because the investigation required to answer it has not been done. What is interesting about the hydrothermal framework, from the perspective of this account's broader concerns, is that it points toward a specific and testable geological mechanism, while also being consistent with the physical scale and spatial organization of the features that Anangu oral tradition describes. Hydrothermally formed dissolution cavities and passage networks within a formation the size of Uluru could be very large indeed. They could have the acoustic properties that measurements detect. They could be connected in the ways that tradition describes. They could be structured in patterns that appear organized relative to natural fracture randomness. Hydrothermal geology is extraordinarily capable of producing complex and spatially organized internal structures in rock formations. The question of whether what is inside Uluru is hydrothermally derived geology or something else, or some combination, remains open. The investigation required to close it has not been formally undertaken. Number 29. Every country has one. There is a pattern visible across the world's ancient landscapes, in sites that combine enormous geological significance with the deepest layers of indigenous sacred knowledge, in which the formal scientific record is systematically thinner than the evidence and the knowledge available would justify. The Bighorn Mountains of Wyoming, sacred to multiple indigenous peoples of the Great Plains, contain geological and ceremonial features that formal science has studied at the surface level and not investigated at depth. The high plateau of the Tibetan interior, held sacred in the cosmological frameworks of multiple traditions and containing geological anomalies noted in survey work dating back to the early 20th century, has been studied in some of its dimensions and not others, in ways that correlate consistently with which questions are comfortable to pursue. The deep interior of the Saharan desert contains landscape features that the Tuareg and other Saharan peoples describe in terms consistent with complex subsurface structures, and that geological surveys have flagged as unusual, without formal follow-up investigation. The ancient landscape of the Deccan Plateau in India, underlying some of the oldest continuously occupied territory in South Asia, contains geological and archaeological anomalies that the formal record has noted and not pursued. In every case, the pattern is similar. Great antiquity of human occupation, producing knowledge traditions of unusual depth and specificity. Geological features of unusual character, producing survey anomalies that are documented and not followed up. Formal scientific institutions that approach the uncomfortable convergence between ancient knowledge and measurable physical anomaly with caution, avoidance, and a preference for minimum commitment documentation over definitive investigation. And in every case, the indigenous knowledge tradition that has maintained the longest continuous relationship with the landscape has the most specific and the most internally consistent description of the features that the instruments are beginning to detect. This is not a coincidence of geography. It reflects something about the relationship between depth of human attention and depth of landscape knowledge that Western science, with its relatively short history and its institutional preference for reproducible experiment over multi-generational observation, has not yet developed a framework to fully value. The people who have lived with a landscape for 10,000 generations know things about it that a scientific expedition of 2 years or 10 years or 50 years cannot independently discover. That is not mystical. It is empirical. 2,000 generations of careful observation produce a richer data set than any institutional science program operating within a human career span. The only question is how to read that data set. How to understand a knowledge system whose information is organized in terms that are different from the terms that Western science uses, while being no less precise about the phenomena it describes. Uluru is one instance of a global situation. The question it embodies is not unique to Australia. But Australia, with the oldest continuously occupied landscape on Earth and the oldest continuous knowledge tradition in human history, makes the question clearer and more pressing than anywhere else. Because here the depth of traditional knowledge is greatest, the formal scientific record is most obviously inadequate to what the traditional knowledge describes, and the gap between what the instruments detect and what the formal literature acknowledges is most clearly a function of institutional caution rather than genuine empirical uncertainty. That gap is closing, slowly, in the way that all genuine scientific progress closes the gaps between what is known and what is formally acknowledged. It closes in the margins first, in conference presentations and unpublished interviews and informal academic conversation. Then it closes in secondary literature, in reviews and meta-analyses that cite the anomalous findings as a pattern rather than as individual data points. Then it closes in formal research proposals that frame the questions carefully enough to get funded. And eventually, in years or decades, it closes in definitive investigations that produce peer-reviewed answers. That process is underway at Uluru. It is slow, it is impeded by the legitimate complexity of conducting scientific research at a sacred site under an access framework designed to protect rather than to enable investigation. It is impeded by the professional culture that makes anomalous findings expensive to pursue. It is impeded by the political complexity of the relationship between Australian institutions and Anangu communities. But it is underway. And the direction it is moving, the direction that every available line of evidence has consistently indicated for 60 years, is toward confirmation that there is something extraordinary beneath this rock. Something that has been known for 60,000 years by the people who have never left this country. Something that instruments have been detecting since the first time someone pointed a seismic survey at the desert floor and noted that the returns were not what a uniform sandstone mass should produce. Something that researchers have been finding, individually and privately, and declining to formally claim, in the quiet accumulation of anomalous observations, that this account has spent its full length assembling. The rock knows what it contains. The desert knows. The people who have lived with both, for longer than any other people have lived with any landscape on Earth, know. The question is when the rest of us will be ready to listen carefully enough to understand. Number 30. The mid-roll moment. I want to pause here for a moment and do something unusual, which is to step slightly outside the narrative and acknowledge what we are doing together tonight. If you are still here, if you have followed this account through 29 entries and thousands of words about acoustic chambers and magnetic anomalies and unpublished reports and 60,000-year-old knowledge traditions, then you are someone who finds genuine mystery genuinely interesting. Not the manufactured mystery of a story that has a neat answer waiting at the end, but the real kind. The kind that remains open, the kind that accumulates more evidence without closing toward resolution, the kind that points at something real without yet being able to name it precisely. That is a rare quality. Most people are uncomfortable with sustained uncertainty. We are trained from the earliest age to expect that questions have answers, that mysteries have solutions, that if you follow an interesting trail long enough you arrive somewhere definitive. The questions raised by Uluru resist that expectation. The trail does not end. The evidence accumulates without resolving. The picture gets richer and more detailed without becoming clear. Sitting with that, following it carefully, being willing to hold the complexity and the uncertainty without either dismissing them or over-resolving them into simple claims, is an intellectual practice that I find valuable and that I think this community shares. Drop a comment. Tell me where you are in the world tonight. Tell me which part of this account has stayed with you most. Tell me whether you have ever been to Uluru, whether you have felt whatever it is that people consistently describe feeling in the presence of that rock. Or tell me what question this raised for you that you have not heard asked before. The comments on these accounts are some of the most thoughtful conversations I have found anywhere online, and they have taught me as much about the subjects I research as the research itself. If you are new here, welcome. There are many more accounts in this series, covering sites and questions that follow the same method. Careful, patient, honest engagement with anomalous evidence that the formal record has not fully addressed. The subscription is free. The community is genuinely curious. Come back and we will keep going together. Number 31. The night visitors and the long memory. There is a category of experience at Uluru that the academic literature documents with unusual frequency but discusses with unusual brevity. It appears in anthropological fieldwork accounts, in the journals of early expedition members, in the records of park rangers and researchers who have spent extended time at the site, and in the informal testimonies of visitors who were not looking for anything unusual and found themselves reporting something unexpected. The category is this: a quality of awareness or presence that people experience at Uluru, particularly at night and particularly near the southern base of the rock, that is not easily categorized within the frameworks that visitors bring to the experience. The descriptions vary in vocabulary, as you would expect from people with different cultural and cognitive frameworks. Some describe it in explicitly spiritual terms. Some describe it in terms of a physical sensation, a pressure or a vibration or a warmth that has no obvious thermal source. Some describe it in terms of auditory experience, hearing things that they cannot identify, at thresholds too low to be clearly heard, but too consistent to be dismissed as imagination. And some describe it in terms of heightened emotional state, a quality of feeling, awe, or reverence, or what one expedition member in the 1930s described as the distinct impression that the place was paying attention to them. These are subjective reports. They cannot be entered into a data table and analyzed with statistical methods. They do not constitute evidence in the scientific sense of that word. And because subjective phenomenological experience is not how science operates, the formal literature on Uluru treats these reports, when it acknowledges them at all, as culturally interesting data about human psychological responses to impressive landscape features, not as information about the landscape itself. But considered in the context of everything else in this account, the consistency of these reports is interesting. The specific clustering of unusual subjective experience at specific locations around the rock, particularly the southern face location that acoustic measurements have flagged as anomalous, particularly the areas near the deepest accessible cave passages, particularly in conditions of low wind and minimal artificial light, is a pattern within the pattern. The infrasound data provides a physical mechanism for some of what people describe. Infrasound in the frequency ranges measured at Uluru produces precisely the kinds of physiological and emotional effects that visitors report. A feeling of unease or awe that has no obvious visual source. A sense of presence, a heightened emotional state. These are well-documented infrasound effects in laboratory and field research. The physical phenomenon is real and measurable. The subjective experience it produces is a predictable consequence of that physical reality. But infrasound explains the emotional component of what people describe. It does not easily explain the auditory experiences, which are reported in a range slightly above infrasound, in the very low end of the audible spectrum, or the specific content of those experiences. And it does not explain the reports of visual phenomena, which are rare but present in the accounts, the occasional observation of faint luminescence from specific locations at the base of the rock in complete darkness that has been reported independently by multiple observers across different decades. The Anangu understand these phenomena. They have frameworks for understanding them that are part of the Chukopa cosmological system. The ancestor beings whose presence is associated with specific locations at Uluru are understood as not simply historically present, not simply the authors of past creative actions, but as currently active. The rock is alive in their framework, not metaphorically, but in a specific sense that their experiential knowledge of the site, developed over 60,000 years of close relationship with its phenomena, has generated and maintained. The accounts that non-Anangu visitors give of unusual experiences at the rock are, in their framework, descriptions of real encounters with the features of a landscape that is genuinely active, genuinely responsive, and genuinely beyond the current explanatory capacity of Western science. Whether that framework is literally accurate, or whether it is the most sophisticated indigenous encoding of complex physical phenomena that any tradition on Earth has produced, or whether it is both of those things at once, is a question that the evidence cannot yet close. What can be said is that it is not the description of people who were confused about their landscape. It is the description of people who knew their landscape more completely than any other people have known any other landscape in recorded human history, and whose description of its most unusual features has been consistently confirmed in the limited and imperfect ways that Western scientific methods have been able to approach it at every turn. The rock stands in the desert. It has stood there for 500 million years. The people who know it best have lived with it for 60,000. And the question of what is inside it and beneath it and what it does in the dark of the desert night is still, after all of this, genuinely open. That is not a failure of science. That is science in its most honest condition. Confronting something larger than its current tools, building better tools, approaching the question from more directions, and waiting, as the desert waits, for the moment when the evidence and the knowledge and the trust and the tools are all present at the same time, and the answer becomes possible. We will be here when that happens, and it will be worth the wait. Number 32. The full picture, assembled slowly. We have covered a great deal of ground tonight. More than 30 specific entries, each one a thread in a fabric that covers 6 decades of formal scientific observation, 2,000 generations of traditional knowledge, and a physical formation that has been sitting in the Australian desert for 500 million years, carrying inside it whatever it carries, waiting for the moment when the question is finally asked completely and answered honestly. Let me take a few minutes to assemble what we have found. not to pretend that the picture is complete, but to be clear about what it shows in its current state. The physical evidence for unusual subsurface features at Uluru is multi-sourced, internally consistent, and too persistent to dismiss. Acoustic measurements have identified resonance signatures and absorption anomalies consistent with interior void spaces of significant scale. Magnetic surveys have identified anomalies in structured spatial patterns that do not match random mineral distribution in natural sedimentary rock. Infrared photography and thermal imaging have identified zones of apparent elevated thermal emission at specific locations at the base of the rock that do not correspond to expected solar heating patterns. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have returned data patterns that at least one experienced geophysicist has described as showing architectural regularity inconsistent with solid natural sandstone. And a hydrological study found water movement patterns consistent with organized subsurface pathways of non-random structure. These 5 independent physical measurement streams, developed using different technologies by researchers with different methodological training working at different times over a span of more than 6 decades, all point in the same direction. They point toward a formation that contains, at some scale and in some form, interior structure that the standard geological model of a simple buried sandstone remnant does not predict. The archival and institutional evidence for a pattern of findings followed by closure is also multi-sourced and consistent. The 1958 Bureau of Mineral Resources survey flagged anomalies that were never followed up. The early 1970s geophysics consultancy report was submitted and has been unavailable for 50 years. The 1977 Australian National University research team was removed before completing their program, and their data has not been published. The 1990s GPR Conservation Survey produced a dataset whose full content is inconsistent with the published management report derived from it. And multiple researchers across multiple disciplines have described findings they considered significant and then chose not to publish, citing professional risk, publication, rejection, and the absence of a framework within which anomalous findings about sacred sites could be received without career cost. That pattern is also too consistent across too many independent instances to explain as coincidence. Something about the findings at Uluru has consistently produced institutional responses of caution, avoidance, and minimum commitment documentation rather than formal investigation. Whether that pattern has a single cause or is the emergent product of multiple independent institutional pressures arriving at the same result, it has produced a formal scientific record that is systematically thinner than the body of available evidence justifies. The traditional knowledge evidence is, in some respects, the most profound element of the picture, because it is also the oldest and the most consistently described. The Anangu oral tradition has maintained, for a time period that exceeds the entire age of Western civilization by a factor of 20, a specific and detailed description of Uluru that includes interior spaces, underground connections, active, acoustic, and energetic phenomena, and a spatial organization of subterranean features that is consistent with what the physical instruments have been detecting since the 1950s. That consistency is not the consistency of a tradition describing vague spiritual impressions that happen to match physical measurements by coincidence. It is the consistency of accurate observation, maintained and transmitted across 60,000 years of continuous human relationship with a specific landscape, being confirmed by instruments that were developed on the other side of the world by people who did not know the tradition existed. The convergence of these 3 evidence streams, physical measurement, institutional pattern, and traditional knowledge, points toward a conclusion that has not been formally stated in the scientific literature, but that this account has, over its full length, built toward carefully and honestly. Uluru contains interior and subterranean features of significant scale that are not fully accounted for by the standard geological model. Those features have acoustic, magnetic, thermal, and subsurface structural characteristics that physical measurements have been detecting for 60 years. They have been known to the Anangu traditional custodians of the site for 60,000 years. The formal scientific record is thin on these features not because the evidence for them is weak, but because the institutional and professional frameworks for investigating them have been consistently inadequate to the task. Whether those features are the product of hydrothermal geological processes acting over hundreds of millions of years, or of human activity over the deep history of Australian occupation, or of some combination of both, or of something else entirely, is a question that the available evidence cannot yet close. It is the question that a comprehensive, consented, collaborative investigation of the site would be designed to answer. And it is the question that has been circling in the margins of the formal literature and in the private observations of researchers who have gotten close to it and not published what they found. Since the first acoustic anomaly was measured and the first magnetic survey returned an unexpected reading, and the first researcher sat in a still desert night and heard a sound from inside the rock that had no explanation. The desert keeps its own time. The rock keeps its own secrets. And the question of what is inside and beneath the most ancient and most sacred geological feature of the most ancient continuously occupied continent on Earth will, eventually, receive the formal and honest answer that 60 years of careful, imperfect, structurally limited investigation has been building toward. That answer, when it comes, will not surprise the Anangu. It will confirm what their tradition has known for longer than any other tradition has known anything. And it will ask the rest of us to revise, again, our assumptions about what ancient people knew and what ancient landscapes contain and how long and how carefully you have to look at something before you begin to understand it. The rock has been waiting for 500 million years. We can afford to be patient. Number 33. The silence that speaks. There is one final thing worth sitting with before this account closes, and it is perhaps the most quietly significant of everything we have covered. In the scientific literature on Uluru, across all the geological surveys, the heritage assessments, the conservation reports, the acoustic studies, the magnetic analyses, the hydrological investigations, there is a phrase that appears with unusual frequency when researchers arrive at the edge of what their methods can explain. The phrase is, requires further investigation. It appears in technical appendices, in footnote qualifications, in the closing paragraphs of papers that spent their body carefully documenting anomalous findings and then, at the moment when a conclusion would normally be drawn, stepped back and offered that phrase instead. Requires further investigation. It is the scientific equivalent of a long pause, a held breath, the formal language for standing at the edge of something large and not yet knowing how to cross it. What is striking is how consistently that phrase points in the same direction across sources that have no knowledge of each other. The 1958 Mineral Survey's anomalous subsurface readings require further investigation. The acoustic measurements on the southern face require further investigation. The infrared emission patterns require further investigation. The ground-penetrating radar signatures require further investigation. The magnetic anomaly cluster requires further investigation. 6 decades of researchers, working independently, using different tools, approaching the site from different disciplinary angles, arriving at the same linguistic resting point. Not a conclusion. A held breath. A collective pause at the edge of something they could measure but not yet name. That collective pause is itself a kind of answer. When the formal literature of multiple independent disciplines consistently stops at the same place, when the phrase that appears at every edge of the investigation is always the same phrase, that consistency is information. It tells you that something is there. Something that every instrument and every researcher who has pointed themselves at it has found, and that none of them have yet been willing or able to formally claim. The silence of the scientific literature on the central question of Uluru is not the silence of absence, it is the silence of presence. The silence of something so large and so anomalous and so structurally difficult to formally address that the default response has been to document it carefully, note that it requires further investigation, and leave it for the next researcher, and the one after that, and the one after that. The Anangu have a different relationship with silence. In their tradition, certain things do not need to be said to be known. The rock does not need to announce what it contains. The knowledge does not need to be published to be true. The 60,000 years of relationship between a people and their country is its own kind of record, older and deeper and more complete than anything the formal scientific literature has produced. Both forms of knowing are pointing at the same place. The held breath of the scientific literature and the long knowledge of the traditional custodians. The instruments that detect and cannot yet explain, and the tradition that explains what the instruments are detecting. They are not opposed. They are two approaches to the same truth, arriving from different directions, waiting in the same silence for the moment when the explanation becomes possible and the held breath is finally released. Outro. If you have stayed with this for the full length of the journey tonight, I want to thank you for the attention you gave it. These are questions that deserve careful attention, not sensationalism, not easy answers, not the kind of dramatic certainty that makes good television but bad thinking, just the careful, patient, honest following of evidence to wherever it leads, and the willingness to sit with the uncertainty when the evidence runs out before the answer arrives. What I hope you take from this is not a definitive conclusion. I do not have one to offer, And anyone who tells you they do is offering you comfort rather than truth. What I hope you take is the sense that Uluru is more complex, more layered, more genuinely mysterious in ways that physics and geology and the instruments of Western science are actually beginning to confirm than the picture in any tourist brochure or geology textbook. And I hope you carry some feeling for the Anangu people, whose knowledge of this place is so old and so deep that it makes the entire history of Western scientific investigation look like a single afternoon. They know things about this rock that our instruments are only beginning to detect. They have maintained that knowledge through 60,000 years of occupation and through a colonial period that did its best to destroy everything they knew. The fact that their knowledge is still there, still being maintained, still shaping the terms on which this country is understood and protected, is extraordinary. It is a kind of miracle. If this kept you company tonight, if it settled your mind for sleep, or kept you curious through a long, quiet evening, I am glad for it. The world is full of things that are stranger and older and deeper than we have been taught to expect. Sitting with that, letting it be real without needing to resolve it, is one of the healthier habits a mind can have. There are more stories like this one. Older places, deeper questions, things that instruments detect and knowledge systems hold and the official record quietly avoids. Come back and we will go through them together, as slowly as they deserve, as carefully as they require. Leave a comment and tell me where you are in the world tonight. Tell me what question from this account stayed with you longest. The community that gathers in these comments is one of the things that makes this work worthwhile, and your being here is part of what keeps it going. There is something I want to leave you with tonight that is not about mystery or anomaly or the gap between what is known and what is officially acknowledged. It is something simpler and older than any of the questions this account has raised. The Central Australian desert at night is one of the most profound sensory experiences available on this planet. The darkness is absolute, away from any settlement. The stars are not the faint scattered points you see from a city. They are a river of light that fills the entire sky from horizon to horizon, the Milky Way visible as a bright band, the southern constellations wheeling overhead, the absolute silence broken only by the occasional night bird or the soft movement of a desert breeze. And at the center of all of it, the enormous dark mass of the rock, blotting out the stars at its own height, radiating the warmth it collected from the sun during the day back into the cool desert night. People who have spent nights at Uluru, in the era before the national park infrastructure enclosed most of the experience in visitor facilities, describe it in terms that are consistent across cultures and backgrounds. Something about the combination of the immense scale of the rock, the absolute darkness, the overwhelming star field, and whatever acoustic and energetic phenomena the rock produces in those hours, creates an experience that people reach for words like sacred to describe without necessarily having a religious framework to put it in. Not a conceptual sacredness, a physical one, a quality of the place itself. The Anangu have names for the qualities of different times and conditions at Uluru. The rock at dawn, when the colors change from deep purple to amber to burning red in the space of 20 minutes, has its quality. The rock during the brief and violent desert rainstorms, when waterfalls appear on every curved surface and the dry desert floor runs with temporary rivers, has its quality. The rock at night has its quality. These are not metaphors. They are descriptions of different states of a living thing, a thing that changes and responds and has properties that vary with time and condition in ways that 60,000 years of careful observation have documented completely. Western science does not yet have the tools to fully describe all of what the Anangu describe. It is not that their description is wrong. It is that the description is richer than what the current scientific vocabulary can encode. The instruments detect pieces of it, the acoustic anomalies, the magnetic variations, the thermal signatures, and each piece is consistent with the fuller picture that the traditional knowledge holds. But the fuller picture is still ahead of the instruments. That gap, between what the instruments currently detect and what the knowledge tradition describes, is the frontier. It is where the most interesting science of the next generation will be done, if it is done with the care and the reciprocity and the genuine collaborative intent that the situation requires. It is where the oldest knowledge tradition on Earth and the newest measurement technologies will eventually meet, and if the meeting is handled honestly, confirm each other. Until that happens, what we can do is hold the question carefully, neither dismissing it as fringe speculation nor overclaiming certainty that the evidence does not yet support. Sitting with the accumulated weight of 60 years of anomalous findings and 2,000 generations of traditional knowledge pointing in the same direction, and allowing ourselves to feel the appropriate response to genuine, serious, well-evidenced mystery. That response is not certainty. It is not dismissal. It is the quality of attention that a great question deserves. Careful, sustained, open, patient. The same quality of attention that the desert rewards in anyone who brings it to the landscape. Uluru has been there for 500 million years. It will be there after all of us. The questions it embodies will outlast this account, and many accounts like it. But the asking matters. The careful, honest, patient asking always matters. And tonight, in whatever dark corner of the world you have been listening from, you have been part of that asking. That is not nothing. It is, in fact, everything. Good night. Sleep well, and remember that underneath every flat and ordinary landscape, something very old is always waiting to be found.